So today I am joined by Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who is a lecturer at Rice University in America who deals with Palestinian and Middle Eastern history. And also how this has sort of come about is thanks to his wonderful podcast, Thowra, which is a mini-series hosted by the Dig Radio of Jacobin magazine along with Daniel Denvir. And it is one of the most excellent resources. And for anyone who has sort of enjoyed any of my content and wants something that is longer form, that not only discusses Palestine, but also dives into some of the much wider issues of the Middle East throughout the 20th century, then I cannot recommend this enough. From the rise of Nasser to the war on terror and its after effects, this is truly one of the most excellent, accessible pieces of media that does not require diving into academic textbooks or even finding ones that are up to date. And so this is sort of in some ways a puff piece for Thowra, because honestly, I cannot recommend this piece enough. So yeah, let's get straight into sort of the questions that I had for you, if that's okay, Abdul.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Now, I'd like to open with talking about one of the most fundamental aspects to the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian liberation. And this is the way in which Palestinians have been painted as rejectionists by figures from Joe Biden all the way back to Bill Clinton. They are portrayed as people who have consistently been within touching distance of some kind of wonderful, equitable solution. Now, what is your sort of opinion on this, and how do you talk about Palestinians as rejectionists?
Well, I mean, let's think of it from a different angle. What are Palestinians rejecting? If we're saying that they're rejecting settler colonialism, if we're saying that they're rejecting the domination of their people and the usurpation of their lands, then yes, absolutely, the Palestinian national project, the National Liberation Project, has been centered on emancipatory goals that are fundamentally different and opposed to the projects of domination that were imposed on the Palestinian people. And that includes, by the way, the so-called peace process that people regularly refer to. It includes the original so-called partition plan that was imposed on the Palestinian people by a United Nations that was dominated at the time by Western powers. A partition plan that is a misnomer. Partition is a misnomer for that plan, actually, Chris, because it was actually a plan to set up a settler colonial state in Palestine. So, of course, our people rejected that. But that does not mean that our people are rejectionists. In fact, the people who are rejectionists are the settler colonial forces, the imperial powers, who reject a vision of equality, who reject a vision of freedom, who reject a vision of independence for the Palestinian people, a vision of self-determination, a vision of national, political, economic, and social rights for our people. And that is basically the vision that they've been trying to combat for decades through various means, and now it's culminating in genocidal eliminationist means.
I mean, that was honestly just such an excellent answer. And so are you of the opinion that the two-state solution and discussions of it are nothing more than giving cover to Israel to continue the project of colonization of Palestinian land?
Yes, I mean, let's look at Yitzhak Rabin. He was the architect of the concept of separation within the West Bank and within Gaza. The idea was that Israelis and Palestinians should be separate, that there should be physical barriers separating them. And this later on, by the way, translates into the apartheid wall. It translates into the siege on Gaza. It translates into the current Bantustanization of the entirety of the West Bank into more than 200 little enclaves that are closed at whim by Israeli soldiers, in which there's no freedom of movement, in which there's a total state of siege, in which settler colonists living in these awful things called settlements, but they're actually in reality colonies, okay, that are constructed on expropriated Palestinian lands, can attack at whim whenever they want, backed by the Israeli colonial army. They attack our people. They attack their crops. They attack their animals. And in the meantime, they expropriate their water resources and they turn their life into hell. And this is a vision that he came up with through this concept of separation. Really, Yitzhak Rabin, for you to understand, and you have to think about what he did in 1967, for example. 1967, he was involved in this war of aggression in a major way. You have to look at what he was doing in the first Intifada, where he actually was the architect of the policy of breaking the limbs and the legs of Palestinian children and youth. He said he ordered Israeli army forces to break their legs. Can you imagine this? This is an assault on childhood. And here I must make a shout out to the great Palestinian intellectual who's under threat at the moment, and she's absolutely wonderful. The amazing scholar from Jerusalem, Nadira Shalhoub Kevorkian, who has coined the term unchilding to refer to people like Rabin and those that came after him, that basically created a framework for thinking about our people as not being human, and about our children as not even being entitled to their own childhood. This is the outlook that we're dealing with here, Chris. And these are the people that are celebrated as heroes of peace in the most Orwellian manner possible. Now, does that mean that the Israeli right is worse than Rabin, or that there is no difference between them? There is a difference between them. One vision was a vision of creating a Bantustan-like reality in Palestine. It was like the South African apartheid model. This was essentially Rabin's model, with some of the trappings of sovereignty, claims around sovereignty, not real sovereignty, of course. So it was like, let's create an image of an independent sovereign Palestinian state, but one that is constructed on as much diminished land as possible, one that is surrounded by a sea of settlements, i.e. colonies, one that has no control over its borders, airspace, that has no capacity of defense. It can be invaded anytime. It can be played around with anytime. One that is ultimately under the yoke of Israeli Zionist power.
Recently, I've been reading quite a lot about the tripartite aggression, or the Suez Crisis as it's sometimes known, and one of the things that was so striking to me about it, especially for the here and now, is the occupation of Gaza that first of all occurs, but the plans that the Israeli Labour Party or members of the Israeli Labour Party were espousing, talking about pushing basically the Muslim population out of Lebanon, taking parts of Jordan, moving and then resettling all of the Palestinians from Jordan to Iraq. And so I think that with one of the key discussions that has come up, especially since October the 7th, is Zionists always like to frame what happened in 1948 as this kind of event where, Palestinians just sort of ethnically cleansed themselves, they left their own homes, or they just lost a war and they got ethnically cleansed. But seemingly, what you are talking about here is the fact, and I'd love you to expand on it, is the fact that these seeds of the desire to remove Palestinians are not something that's specific to the right. They are something that spreads across the entire Zionist movement. And actually, in one of Patrick Wolf's best quotes, he always says with the Nakba that to focus on the watershed is to forget what subtends the event. That colonization is not something that magically happened, and ethnic cleansing wasn't an event, really. This is the structure of Zionism.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. I mean, what is Zionism at the end of the day? It is the idea of bringing an entire population, primarily from Eastern Europe, into Palestine. For whatever reasons, let's forget about the big glamorous claims that were associated with it. Claims about liberating Eastern European Jews, claims about ending anti-Semitism, claims. There were all sorts of claims made around Zionism. But none of these claims had anything to do with the Palestinian people. However, the whole endeavor, when it came to practice, was all about the Palestinian people. So what's amazing about Zionism is that its violence is entirely directed against the Palestinian people, but it has an image of itself as some kind of self-centered project for emancipation and liberation. And this is like a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, we see it in other colonial movements as well. You know, often colonists have this notion that they're doing something great and that they're escaping persecution elsewhere. We know this from the story of the United States of America, where I currently teach. The colonists that founded the initial New England colonies were claiming to be, you know, people who were fighting for religious freedom, that were escaping persecution, and that came to the shores of the United States, what is now the United States, what was actually Turtle Island. And, you know, their whole endeavor is this great endeavor. The question that remains is, what about the people on the land? What have they done to them? What are they currently doing to them? And what is happening in Palestine is a continuation of similar practices and similar structures. You have these grand visions of colonization that do not care about the people on the ground and will make any argument possible to ensure that the people on the ground are removed. And almost in all of these visions, Chris, they pretend to be engaging in a defensive project. The colonists in the Americas claim to be defending themselves against the savagery of the native people, even though they were the ones intervening in the lives of native people. They were the ones stealing their lands. They were the ones that were killing them with arms and disease and epidemics, and that were preventing, starving their populations by killing their flocks and destroying their crops, as the Israelis are doing today in Gaza. So, and yet, what do we hear about? Oh, they were defending themselves against attacks and raids. Same thing in Palestine. Supposedly, these people are just defending themselves. And then you ask yourself, okay, what are you doing here in the first place? All right. And the Zionist answer is almost always self-absorbed and narcissistic, because it says, well, God gave us this land. And I'm like, really? And most of these people are secular, Chris, originally. I mean, now you see a religious Zionism. But originally, of course, because not many people know this, its original form, it was opposed by the vast majority of Orthodox rabbis, because they have their own outlook on what it means to have a Jewish presence in the Holy Land and what form it takes. And it was not a state-centered form that they were. And by the way, Palestinians would not have had a problem, and did not have a problem, with people coming as pilgrims or people living there as religious students. What they had a problem with was the idea of setting up a state on their land that is a settler colonist state that does not represent them, that steals their territories, that tells them that they're expendable, their lives are expendable, their presence on the land is expendable. And somehow they have to agree to it, or otherwise they're just violent terrorists and rejectionists, as you noted in your first question. It's quite insane,
Yeah.
Chris.
I mean, one of the things that is very interesting, actually, and this is maybe a wider question about colonialism, is it does almost feel that with Zionism in the modern era, this desire to portray itself as a liberatory movement doesn't actually just come from the sole belief, although the belief is definitely there, in the superiority of themselves over the colonized, but rather also has something to do with growing sort of disdain for colonialism in some way. Do you think that there is like a difference in Zionism's attempt to frame itself as like an anti-colonial movement, or is this just something that, as you say, you know, has always remained in colonial movements for people to basically feel better about killing and starving and stealing from others?
So the interesting thing about this, Chris, is that Zionism shifts its discourse around colonialism. When the Zionist colonial project was being set up, when they established their colonies, and up to the moment where they actually created their settler colonial state, that they were using the word colonization, they were using the word settler colonies, they were talking about colonists all the time. Okay, they were imagining themselves, presenting themselves, and marketing themselves as a colonial project. And anybody that wants to see that, you just have to go back to the original Zionist text. Go back to Herzl's The Jewish State. You will see how he frames it as a colonial endeavor. And he speaks of the Palestinians as the native population. Go back to the father of the current Likudist form of Zionism, the original revisionist Zionist, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who in his book, The Iron Wall, speaks very clearly, not just about Zionism as a colonial project, and not just about Zionists as colonists, but about the native population being comparable to the native populations of the Americas and facing essentially a similar force as that of the conquistadors. And here he says, he actually asks Zionists not to deny the fact that the native population will resist it. He actually says they're going to resist us, and rightly so, because we're invading their lands. But too bad for them. You know, we just have to, the logic of power will win, and we just have to create an iron wall that they cannot penetrate. They'll bang their heads against it until they give up. That's a whole logic. It's a logic of power at the heart of it. Now, after 48, Chris, once they've established a settler colonial state, and once they got the rubber stamp of the UN on it, which meant that now they have a framework for legal legitimation, even though, by the way, there's zero moral legitimacy for this project. Absolutely none. Nobody in the world, not even this organization that at the time was representing the victors of the Second World War, let's not get too romantic around it, okay, could come and say to a people, you know what, we've decided that settler colonists, because of, by the way, it's funny, you should read the actual recommendation to set up the settler colonial state there. They base it on a historic connection, an ancient historic connection. They actually say the native population on the land has been inhabiting it for thousands of years. However, there is this ancient historic connection for this people that's currently in Europe. And on that basis, you know what, we're going to split the land between the two. And even talk about Arab generosity, that they should be generous enough to do that for the sake of the world powers being happy. It is absolutely and utterly disgusting. But once you have this framework of legitimation under the UN, it becomes about, oh, we're defending the sovereignty of the state. Israel is a sovereign state now, and everybody has a right to self-defense. Okay? And the story after 48 becomes, between 48 and 67, it's a story of a nation that is a progressive nation, a democratic nation, surrounded by a sea of barbarism and ignorance and violence that is trying to destroy it. It is in an existential struggle to sustain itself. That's why this is where this whole language about Israel has a right to defend itself. And, you know, every time on TV anybody appears, they keep on trying to grill them, being like, do you believe in Israel's right to exist? No other state you have a discussion around it like that. But here, really, what they're asking there is, do you believe in the reality of erasing Palestinians from their land? Do you believe in the establishment of settler colonialism? And almost everybody then is forced to say yes. If you say, I believe in the right of Israel to exist, you're saying, I believe in its right to have erased the Palestinian people, because that's the land on which it is based. And that's the population it expelled. And that's the population it denied sovereignty over the land. It is horrendous, the amount of Orwellian discourse. Now you get through this phase. Then something happens in 67. The settler colonists expand. They take over everything. You know, in 48, they take over 78% of the land. 67, they take over 100% of the land. And then they spread out even beyond that. They occupy Arab lands belonging to other Arab states. Sinai in Egypt, you know, Golan Heights in Syria, parts of Jordan, territories in Lebanon, and, you know, they take over all these areas. And everybody's supposed to then shift the conversation. Suddenly, the conversation is about regaining those Arab lands, but it's about now the Arab-Israeli conflict and ways to resolve it. And you get this new language about bringing back the two-state solution. And let's talk about the two-state solution now. And the land for peace formula becomes the motto, but actually it's not really peace, it's pacification. And I've said that before many times. There's a big difference between peace and pacification. Peace is about actually finding a just and equitable formula for people to live together in these kind of colonial settings. Pacification is about the settler colonist group actually silencing and dominating the native group and institutionalizing that in arrangements that are acceptable and presentable under international law and within the international existing balance of power. So we have every right to think about, okay, how has the language shifted? They've decided before 48 that they're colonists. Now they're deciding they're not colonists. They're saying that we're an independent state fighting for survival against these savages.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's actually really something that I wanted to go back to, which when you were talking about the original sort of UN writings on Palestine and, well, the creation of the State of Israel, which is this link to the land, this historic link that Jewish people do undeniably have to Palestine. It would be foolish to ignore the fact of there are these, Jewish historic religious sites there, but at the same time, the idea that this is any way similar to the indigeneity or the reason that a group in America, the Native Americans are referred to as indigenous, to me is completely farcical, because it perverts basically the dynamic of colonialism to just mean anything really. So I kind of, obviously it could be somewhat of a sensitive topic on the internet and social media due to it being not really discussed that much. But what do you make of this whole sort of Zionist claim towards indigeneity versus, the fact of Palestinians live there?
Well, I mean, let's be clear, Chris. If this claim is correct, then the Arabs I could now say I'm indigenous to Spain. And the Spanish people have no right to it. Arabs were in Spain as a sovereign entity much longer than Jews were ever sovereign entity in Palestine. And let's get really historical about this. First of all, there was no Jewish presence over the entirety of Palestine. Okay? It was in areas, even if you were to believe those old texts, which we know, by the way, very little about that period. This is the thing about like ancient history 3,000 years ago and making connections to it to the present. It's ridiculous. We don't know enough, and we'll never know enough. Let's start from there. All of it is speculation. We don't even know if anything existed in the way it did as claimed in current studies. And actually, the critical biblical scholarship, for example, completely rejects most of the claims relating to biblical history as communicated through religious texts. But let's not look at, let's assume that we're going to follow the religious text. The kingdom of David and Solomon was in what is now the West Bank. It was not in actually the areas where Tel Aviv is and where most of the Jewish settlements are. Secondly, even if you follow that religious text, what is the story of the Bible? It is the story of colonialism and conquest. It is the story of a guy is born in Iraq, in Ur, and God makes a pact with him, Abraham. And I know I don't want to sound sacrilegious here, but I'm talking just, let's look at the text as text. God makes a deal with a prophet telling him, your people should go now to this land. It's called the land of Canaan. And if you look at the text, that's what it's called. Why is it called the land of Canaan? Because there's a people there called the Canaanites. And it's saying, which is basically, this is the religious basis for this claim, is, well, based on this pact where God is telling this prophet to take his people to this land and to kill and conquer the people that are living on it currently, and then have it as, that's why it's called the promised land in those texts. Okay? So even if we were to base that story, that's a story of ancient colonization and an ancient expulsion and domination of different people. I'm not saying that we should infer anything from it for the present, by the way, because I don't believe in going back 3,000 years back and inferring anything for the present. But what it tells us, though, is that this place has always been diverse. There's been many different people inhabiting it over many different centuries. Okay? But the fact that cannot be challenged is that these different peoples intermixed in that space, and they produced population patterns that continued to the present, and they're embodied in the Palestinian people in the present. The Palestinian people is the accumulation of all the civilizations that have passed through Palestine, in the same way that the people of Britain are the accumulation of all the peoples and the conquerors that have passed through Britain. You know, there were Danes in Britain. There were Normans that came and conquered it. There were Celts, and there were many different ancient peoples who would come, and now there are many people coming from across the world and contributed to British culture in very profound ways, including Jews from Eastern Europe, including people from South Asia, including Arab people from different parts of North Africa and the Middle East. It's an incredible mix of peoples. It would be ridiculous to come with some racialized construct that claims that one group has a monopoly on that history, and that based on some religious connection, no matter how profound that religious connection is, has a right to that territory and has a right to expel the current population from it. You know, if we were to apply that law, and Palestinians have been saying this from day one of Zionism, then the whole world would be a place of chaos and horror, because the Arabs and Berbers can come and say, we want Spain now, and we want Sicily. Why are there Italians in Sicily? These are, you know, even though, by the way, in Spain, and Andalusia, and in Sicily, I'm sure there are Arab lineages there. They've just, what happens usually is a cultural transformation and a religious conversion in these places. It's not like the Arabs that were there all died. And it's not like the Viscos that were before the Arabs in Spain all disappeared. They just get mixed with the force that comes through the space and becomes part of the mix. But anyways, in the modern world, we've established norms, and that's precisely to prevent the chaos of constant conquest and constant instability based on the rules of power. That was meant to be the basis of the international order. This is where the idea of self-determination came from. Perversely, in the case of Palestine, it's precisely those that were claiming that they were enforcing the concepts of international order, respect for people's self-determination, in the aftermath of the First World War, that imposed this on Palestinians and told them, well, you know what, you're going to be the exception. We're not going to allow you to determine your own fate or your own land, because you know what, we believe in a text that you don't happen to believe in, by the way, and that those of you that happen to believe in have a different reading of it. Palestinian Christians have a different reading of the Bible. Actually, Palestinian Muslims believe in many parts of it, but they have a different reading also. They don't infer from it a right to conquest and a right to establish a settler colonial state on their land. Okay? They have a different story around it, and we're not going to go into the details around that. Eastern churches have a different story around it. Catholic Church has a different story around it. It just happened that Britain, which was a Protestant power, that had the influence of very powerful Protestant ideologies in the 19th century that were restorationist, had the cultural environment, okay, that emphasized this notion of the restoration of the chosen people to the promised land. So already this idea was there in the deep psyche. And you see that institutionally very much so. If you look at the history of the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were people that were very committed to the project of colonizing Palestine and setting up a Jewish state there. Those people tended often to come from congregations that were committed to these ideas ideologically. So you had Scottish Presbyterians, for example, that were very, very heavily involved in this project initially. You had also people that belonged to different Congregationalist churches. And I don't want to go into the theology around it, Chris, but Palestinians had nothing to do with this theology. They didn't figure in it. We were just seen as heathens that had to be removed. We were seen as as a blemish in the otherwise great history of that land. The entirety of the wonderful, presence of Palestinians on the land was removed. And when I say the word wonderful, I'm not saying that the presence of Palestinians is better than the presence of anybody on their land, But unfortunately, when we're dealing with those ideas, they were often also framed in terms of civilization. They were claiming that we're not civilized, and therefore we've neglected the land, we didn't take care of it, and there are people that are better fit for it. And we don't know how to create anything, blah blah blah. It's quite insane. Like, first of all, if you're talking about urban civilization, that came from that land. And secondly, our people built beautiful cities that were there's something like the Haram al-Sharif. This is one of the greatest pieces of architecture of all time. Dome of the Rock, how beautiful that is. They want to destroy that. The same people that were saying we don't know how to do civilization want to do this act. Look at Gaza. They've destroyed the Omari Mosque in Gaza, one of the oldest mosques in the world. They've destroyed the archives, the libraries. Gaza was a center of ancient learning because it's the point at which Africa and Asia connect. It is this incredible place. But we were supposed to somehow accept this narrative that we're savages, that we can't produce civilization, that there are better people out there, and that God gave them the land. And God gave us no right to be there. And we're heathens. We're awful people. And we should just pack our bags and leave because these people say so. Does that sound right, Chris? And by the way, if we resist this, then we're haters. We're haters and anti-Semites if we resist this. Look at the insanity of this. And who are telling us that? Europeans that created the Holocaust and that persecuted Jews in their land for centuries, and that engaged in heinous acts ranging from pogroms to gas chambers. It's not Palestinians that were doing that. It's these Europeans that are telling us that we have to give away our land. How appalling it is. I mean, it fills me with such sorrow, Chris, and pain and rage and a mix of all of these feelings, because the total disregard for us, the total misrepresentation is unbelievable. This whole project sometimes makes me want to cry the way they talk about these things, Chris. And I do cry about it sometimes. I'll be very honest with you. It's so painful. Just thinking of it. I don't know what to say sometimes.
There was I don't know if you saw it, but recently there was a video of a Lebanese woman who'd, the first video was her playing piano in this gorgeous, amazingly beautiful home. And the second video was just Israeli soldiers sort of playing with that piano. And I don't know what's so, but there's something eerily haunting when someone just literally put the two videos together, and to see this fact of and just to think about how much was lost, not just in terms of, and I think this is actually something that I really wanted to talk about. People have become obsessed with the death element of genocide. And I remember when I first started reading about Saddam Hussein's extermination of the Kurds, and thinking about just all of these Kurdish villages that were written, I think they were in German, it's in the Exeter archives, but anyway, they were written in German, and there is no trace of them in English online anywhere. These ancient historical things, villages, just gone in seconds. And as we were talking about earlier, it is not a thing that is specifically related to one event. It's not the Nakba. This has been the entirety of Israel's project there. I mean, in Kanafani's work, he's claiming that already, is it around 20,000 Palestinians had been displaced by 1931, and even if that's accurate, it's probably lower maybe than the reality, who knows? But just, I think that this is probably one of the most important parts with regards to Palestine that connects with what you're saying here, is this genocide of Palestine. For me personally, and I don't know what your opinion is, the idea of just talking about who's dead lags far behind the reality of wiping away, actually, in fact, Gaza, even take Gaza as like a space of like a collective memory that is a point at which that is filled with such a history that extends far beyond Israel's recent presence there. And just to wipe that away is in of itself an act that is what genocide really is. That if you are to remove these beautiful things that were built for generations by people in Gaza, that matters as much as killing a human being, because you are taking away the very existence of people, and that to me is all Israel has ever been, this colonial project to wipe away what once was in Palestine. And this is why I think that the term is actually used differently by the scholar I'm thinking of, but it's inescapably genocide. There is no other word in the lexicon that can actually describe this, to describe a project which is centered around the idea that, as you're saying, that Palestinians did not matter, that their contribution just for thousands of years was meaningless because they weren't the right people doing it. And so I guess that when to like bring this back to a question is, do you see genocide as this thing that extends beyond this UN definition that to me does not serve a purpose? Is not fit for purpose, sorry. It obviously serves a purpose.
I mean, the difficult thing to talk about here, Chris, is how much this UN definition now fails people that are subjected to genocide. Because let me say something about this. If we look at the history of genocide, it was the very term was coined by a Jewish scholar who was very concerned with preventing what he saw as something that was going to happen and going to spread. And there was this preventative dimension to the logic that he used. Lampkin was somebody who was trained in international law, who had an understanding of also the fact that you could have this banality of evil, to use Hannah Arendt's term, operate on a grand scale in these situations, and where death becomes nothing, okay, for the powers that are in charge. But this is not just about death. I mean, he talked a lot about culture, and if you follow writings on the development of the concept, there was a lot in Lampkin and others about culture. It was about the ability of people to reproduce their society. It was about the prevention of social reproduction. And this is why when you look at what they're doing in Gaza, what are they doing? One area that I've done a lot of work on and I've spoke a lot about and I've also focused on conceptually is scholasticide. I mean, the term was actually coined by my mentor, Professor Carmen Abulsi, who's an incredible professor in Oxford, but she had a long history before that as a great Palestinian representative and an incredible intellectual, but also was a great scholar of the laws of war. I would highly recommend, by the way, for anyone that wants to understand the current moment, to go back to Karma's book, Traditions of War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Law. And that's a book not about Palestine at all. It's actually set in the 18th century for the most part, and 19th century. And it's set in Europe. And it's talking about places like Poland and Corsica and other places that were subjected to the armies of imperialism and invasion. But it was saying that those armies always framed what they were doing as an act of God or a fact of nature. It's in the nature of things to conquer, to dominate. And therefore, everything in war is permissible for them. She called this the martialist tradition. And of course, the martialist tradition is very much the sort of tradition that leads towards this genocidal thinking. It's saying, too bad for these Palestinians, too bad for these people in Gaza. They're an obstacle in our way. So you remove them, just like you remove a cockroach. And just like, that's why, by the way, they use their language of cockroaches. They use, bestial language because, of course, and I don't want to get into this on a tangent, but of course, we've normalized the domination of animals in our human conduct and the domination of nature, which I'm sure environmentalists have a lot to say about. But then we use it and we extend it to other human beings to say, you can do whatever you want with this being. You have full authority over them. Destroy them. Destroy their ability to reproduce themselves. destroy their ability to actually transmit their culture, their way of being. There are entire family lines that have been lost now in Gaza because of this. I know some of these families that no longer exist. Nobody. There's no descendants. What do you say to that? I mean, it is unbelievable. I have friends, Chris, dear friends, that have lost more than 200 relatives. I don't think anybody can fathom what that means. The thing is, like, the media in the West is so appalling, Chris. Like, because if you're in the Arab world, you can at least know about these families and you will see their faces and names on a regular basis. Okay, so every day, like you open, for example, Jazeera today, you will see this morning the headline was 37 new martyrs this morning, and they'll mention the families and they'll talk about where it happened. And then they'll discuss the rest of the news relating to it, the political aspect or whatever. And you'll have a report from the different hospitals that are being destroyed. You'll have a report. None of that you get in the Western media. And the only reason why young people know about what's going on is because they're glued to social media. But even then, you get a partial picture. You'll get, like, aspects of the story here and there. So the full scale of the horror, I don't think any of us understand it. I don't think even, I was talking to my friend in Gaza the other day. He was telling me that it was a very poor internet connection, but we managed to have a conversation. And, he was telling me about how half of the time he doesn't know what's going on in other parts. And that's part of the horror, because then he has to fear for the people he knows in other parts. It's like a very difficult, and that's a tiny, tiny, tiny spot of land, Anyways, to go back to the original point, if you want to disrupt social reproduction, what do you do? If you want to disrupt social reproduction, which is actually a key element of genocide, if you want to prevent a society from reproducing itself culturally, biologically, socially, if you want to break down its bonds, what you do is you first target the institutions that make life possible. Okay? Which means that you don't want any health infrastructure. You don't want hospitals. This is why they've been targeting hospitals on a regular basis, Chris. And initially, by the way, it's so disgusting, the BBC and other Western media, when they were claiming that these hospitals, remember when the genocide first started and they were questioning whether it's an Israeli rocket that hit the Mahmadani hospital or not? And, well, guess what? Since then, they've attacked every single hospital. And not just through rockets, through invasions and multiple invasions. And they've paraded doctors naked on the ground, and they've taken them hostage, and they tortured them, and they killed and executed in summary executions, several of them. And it's always, of course, through using this insane language of self-defense. Really? Bullshit claims, I'm sorry to use this term, about hospitals being command centers. I'm like, you know what? First of all, if you've been targeting them so much, who would be stupid enough to set up a command center there? Secondly, and more importantly, how could they even function as command centers when you have thousands of people seeking refuge in them on a regular basis? Anybody who's visited or seen footage from a Gaza hospital, and we have now numerous eyewitness accounts from British, American, Arab, and other doctors who came from across the world there. And they came back saying there's barely enough space to breathe in the hospital. And doctors are overstretched. They're working there. These are heroes. The ones they're accusing of being commanders. They're heroes. They're saving lives. They are actually commanders in their own way in the battle against death and barbarism, true barbarism, colonial barbarism, genocidal barbarism. These nurses that are working day and night, non-stop. Everybody in those spaces, it's unbelievable. So there's a disruption then of the biological life through attacking these institutions, through attacking the food supply. Why else would you actually ruin lands that produce crops intentionally on a regular basis? Why would you prevent food aid from coming in? And it's always the same excuse. Oh, it's terrorism, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Oh, and guess what? Now the UN is terrorism. The UN is Hamas. Let's ban the UN. Did you see that Knesset law, Chris? I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, but in my understanding, this is just a culmination of a very long. At first, initially, UNRWA was basically a way Israel didn't have to deal with the refugees, and some of them had an interest in that, right? But increasingly, it's become a problem because it maintains the very important fact of Palestinians are refugees. As you were just saying, they don't just exist as foils to some kind of magical realization of the perfect Israeli state. Palestinians are people who are, for no explicable reason, are continually denied a right to return to a land that would be safe for them because they represent, and I think this is why it's so important to keep within, this structure of, they represent a demographic threat. They represent a threat to the state of Israel on the basis of I'm sure that you're well aware of him, but I think it's the interesting question that Kahana and actually the far right pose to Israel. He says over and over again, you cannot be a Jewish state and a democracy because one day those Palestinians will vote you out of existence. And this is clearly a tacit thing that so many of them are unwilling to openly say, but remains this truth. This decision to ban UNRWA has nothing to do with terrorism, has nothing to do with the fact that, maybe one or few employees may have been involved. Israel doesn't care about that. They knew who was employed. But the thing is that for them, it is just fantastic to get rid of because it's another, as you say, another lifeline that's not even a very competent lifeline, in my understanding from talking to people from Gaza, that doesn't operate in the way they would hope and doesn't look after them in the way they would hope. But yet Israel, as you are saying, as this wider genocidal structure, it must be cut because Palestine cannot exist within the Zionist vision, and anything that sustains it.
Right, absolutely correct, Chris. And to go back to this point of social reproduction, anything that aids in the reproduction of Palestinians as biological beings, the Palestinian body, whether it's through food or through health, or the Palestinian as an idea, as a thought, as an identity, has to be destroyed as far as this genocidal project is concerned. So, UNRWA's schools are very important because, yes, you mentioned there's a lot of deficiency in the funding, there's bad provision, but at the same time, they're important. They actually do provide decent education, and therefore, they're important for our people. They must be destroyed. UNRWA's schools are deficient in terms of how they teach the history of Palestine, by the way, because for years and from the very beginning, they were always scrutinized. They're prevented from teaching our history the way we want it to be taught, and our poems the way we want it to be taught, our curriculum the way we want it to be taught. Everything that relates to the Palestinian people is put under such scrutiny. And the scrutiny is directed towards preventing us from reproducing our identity as Palestinians and from talking to our kids about the things that matter to them the most. However, even with all these restrictions, now that's not enough for the Israelis, because what they want is the eradication of the people, at least when it comes to their presence on the land. Okay, so you either have two options. The option number one is expulsion, and when they can't do expulsion, they just have to do eradication. So when it comes to the hospitals, when it comes to the schools, when it comes to the universities, which is the sector I've worked with the most, okay, like scholasticide, I was referring to that earlier. That was a term coined by Carmen Abulsi. I worked with some wonderful colleagues, and Desai and others, on developing actually the criteria, updated criteria for that concept. Because, and we developed a scholasticide toolkit that's, people can check it out through Scholars Against the War in Palestine. I mean, the amount of violence they're committing against universities is unbelievable. They've destroyed, Chris, every single university in Gaza. That means 12 institutions. Can you imagine? I want to do a little exercise. How about this? Let's play role reversal. If Palestinians had destroyed every single Israeli university, what would have been the response in the UK? Would people have said, well, the Israelis are violent and they've been dominating Palestinians, therefore Palestinians have a right to destroy and demolish and celebrate on social media this destruction? Or would they have called us barbarians and book burners? And, they would have made, I don't know. I mean, you know the UK better than I do, even though I lived there for a long time. What do you think would be the reaction, Chris? Seriously.
I mean, just as someone who was there last year at university, I mean, the reaction would have been very obvious. Like, it would have just been instantaneous cutting of any program of any, even the most vague ties with a Palestinian university.
I think it would have been more. I think it would have been much worse than that. I think they would have demanded, actually, possibly even a genocidal action against our people. Because that's essentially what they did after October 7th. They would have said these are barbarians that are book burners. They're killing knowledge. They're murdering students and professors. Okay. In the meantime, you have the Israeli state, which has cordial, not only just cordial, close, intimate relations with the UK government. And it's given weapons by the UK government to carry out this act. As in, I can actually legitimately tell you, Chris, the UK has waged war indirectly on the Palestinian people. Actually, it's waged war on us a long time ago, ever since it sponsored this colonial project on our land. But now it's waging a genocidal war through providing weapons that are used to destroy our universities and hospitals. Can you imagine if Palestinians went after every single hospital in the Israeli state and burned it and bombed it? Can you imagine if we had paraded their doctors and nurses and submitted them to sexual violence and actually laughed about it and talked about it and posted about it on social media? And it's not just a rumor, by the way, and it's not just some unfounded claim. It's well established, and they talk about it all the time. They talk about, doing acts that violate people's bodies, and they joke about it publicly. And then the public gets asked about this there, and the majority say they're fine with it. Is this like, how would the UK public have reacted to that? Seriously.
I think that one tiny thing I just wanted to add here is that not only are all of these things that you are saying completely true, these are also being carried out by British citizens who are also sharing what they are doing on social. Well, Americans most definitely. There are a considerable amount of clips. There's even an Israeli, a guy who's not even an Israeli, an American who was on a tourist visa who served in Gaza and is now in Lebanon. Like the all of this, what you're saying is completely correct, but this element of like, these are British citizens who are acting in the most heinous ways, and of course they have done this historically, not even just historically, in Afghanistan, Iraq, all of these places. But what is so notable about this is a massive amount of the Israeli army are basically just foreign mercenaries from like England, America, South Africa, Belgium, all of these places who just go without condemnation, and you say, as you say, nothing. What would you even imagine if Hamas's attack on October the 7th was made up of random Muslims from the UK? It would literally be, like, the discourse that it would produce would be probably worse than post 9/11. You would be talking about people, as you say, calling directly to sort of target the Muslim community in the UK, and maybe, I don't even know what to say. Like, these, you have this expression of such awful extremism. British citizens who get to go out and, as you say, go after hospitals, schools, maybe take photos of themselves. I'm sure you've seen it, of the guy who's burning the books in one of the universities, to just sit there as if it's some fun spectacle. But it's almost just all of it is just this madness of coloniality, almost, that there is no sanity in it, that this is just complete violence and brutality just for the sake of it, because they can. There's not even pretext anymore in northern Gaza with the whole, it's hidden under Shifa is, a massive terror base, or the Palestinians are doing it themselves. There's no pretext. They haven't even offered any evidence for what they're doing into these hospitals. They are just in them, as you say, taking people out, humiliating them. And the particularly touching one was the director of, I can't remember which hospital recently, who said, they killed my son as punishment. Just to hear a doctor utter those words, my son was killed to punish me for doing my job. What do you even say? Like, what is even there to say? How is one supposed to have a reasonable reaction to this? How is one supposed to contain, this feeling of emotion that is almost all-consuming after watching this for years? As I'm sure that is even much deeper for you than I, because I'm not Palestinian. These are simply friends of mine. This is not my existence and my fabric of being exterminated simply because that's what Israel wants to do.
I know, Chris, and I'll be very honest with you. A lot of Palestinians now, and I know quite a few of them, especially ones that are from Gaza, but also others that are from other parts of Palestine that are seeing our sisters and brothers getting massacred there. A lot of them are refusing to talk, or they're having a difficult time talking, or they feel that they talk so much and nothing happens, and they come on a wonderful platform like yours and nothing happens, and then they feel like, okay, where's the hope in this world? Because you're surrounded by so much, not only denialism. Now it's become an interesting phenomenon, Chris. Almost there's no more denialism. It's become something else, because now, initially there was denialism. We were confronted by people saying, well, it's not a genocide, it's not this, it's not that. And then when, every single human rights organization, every single UN body, every single international court finds that there's immense grounds for, this is the greatest concentration of war crimes of all kinds, genocidal and others. There's multiple terms that apply. Urbanicide, there's zillions of terms, okay? In the shortest amount of time in the 21st century, in the smallest space, all unfolding in this. And you see that the situation has been going on for 396 days. We thought initially maybe they'll keep on going until Christmas. Then we thought they'll keep on going until Ramadan. How can Western leaders keep on funding them, giving them diplomatic cover and weapons for that long? Surely these are democratic countries. Maybe people can do something about it. Surely your average British citizen and French citizen and if not American citizen will do something to stop this. And to be fair, I've been on a couple of the marches in London when I was visiting, and I think the citizens are having similar. I wouldn't say they're, as you mentioned, it's a bit different when you're Palestinian living through this genocide. I don't know anybody who's not actually deep down inside, if not actually on the surface, depressed, demoralized, and wounded, and barely living in many ways. Sometimes I feel like I'm living and I'm not living. It's affecting every sphere of my being, by the way. And I'm not. Now, I don't want to make it about myself, but I'm just giving it as an example because, you're hosting me, so I'll talk about, it's like, and then you have to produce all sorts of like modes of dissonance and compartmentalization to be able to just function and appear on an interview like this. Everybody is doing that in Palestine. This is not to mention the people in Gaza who are just like, I don't know, like you talk to them and it's like, or the people who have lost everything in Gaza and ended up outside. Unbelievable. I can't even begin to say, Chris. But I feel when I was going out on these demonstrations, I felt that the people that know in places like Britain and elsewhere do not approve of this, and they're horrified, and they're just as. But our biggest enemy is demoralization, Chris, because there's been a de-democratization in these countries. This genocide has exposed the fact that the governments do not represent the popular sovereignty. They don't represent the mood of the people or what the people want. Some of that has been connected to the Israeli genocidal project. Some of it has been connected to much bigger forces that are structural. But definitely when it comes to the Palestinian angle of it, the Israeli authorities, the Israeli state in particular, has been intervening in British politics in direct ways. It happened during the Jeremy Corbyn campaign. It happened even before that. It happened through, making constant false claims of anti-Semitism, for example, redefining what anti-Semitism is, accusing Jews of being anti-Semitic if they decide to be pro-Palestinian or actually anti-genocide even. Okay, so the whole thing became just an insane exercise. And I think that, however, that this will be not just a scar on the consciousness of every citizen of the world that has experienced this. And I am feeling it especially with young people. There are older generations that are infected with colonial thinking, Chris, that never saw a problem with genocides to begin with. I'll be very honest with you. I was once speaking at a church in the US, and I spoke about the genocide, and the guy said, it was this old dude, like, he'd been, and who comes and says, like, the Arabs are the sons of Ishmael, and they shouldn't be on that land. I would recommend that you just pack your bags and leave, or face the consequences. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what he said. So you do have people that think that way. You do have people also that are so Islamophobic that see no problem with the destruction of our people because we subscribe to a different faith. There are people also that since 9/11 have drank the Kool-Aid of the war on terror and think that somehow they're saving the world through eradicating our people. You have full range of options. However, that is not the majority of the young people in Britain. I haven't seen it. I taught in Britain, and I taught the Middle East in Britain. I've never had anybody join my classroom with these kind of ideas. Never. I've never met anybody, of a certain age group, younger generations, that thinks that way. And that's because the country has undergone through many transformations in the way it views the world. And I don't want to generalize, of course there are different social segments in the country, and there is a right, and there's an organized right, and it reproduces itself through different intergenerational forms as well. But I'm saying in general, you're much more likely to see this associated with the certain generation that is currently in power, who are tied to colonialism in many ways, but also a generation that is corrupted by power, because political establishments have been corrupted by power, and that has to do with class reasons. They're there to serve certain class interests. We know about this. There's a massive relationship between that and big literature on this. It has to do with various other factors, numerous factors. But unfortunately, when it comes to our people, what does it lead to? It leads to a total dehumanization. It leads to absolute complicity. And it leads to the people of the British Isles being told by their governments consistently, we don't care about what you think about this. And now they'll pretend, well, we want to stop Israel's excesses and we're looking for a ceasefire. I'm like, yeah, too late. What are you going to tell to the 10% of our people that have been destroyed and killed in Gaza? That's on you. That's on your record. And don't you dare talk to me about equating our struggles and our disaster that we're facing with your feelings They keep saying, well, I feel like I'm disrespected by the protesters. Or I feel these protesters are tapping into an anti-Semitic agenda. I'm like, really? You don't feel that they're horrified by the death and the killing? You don't feel that these are the true anti-racists in society that do not discriminate against Jews or Muslims or Arabs or anybody, that believe in the equality of human beings. That's why they care about people being massacred anywhere in the world, especially when British weapons are used in British money. But not exclusively, of course. Unbelievable, Chris. Unbelievable.
Yeah, so much of it feels like, it's very interesting. So I don't know if you know what GB News is. It's just a terrible right-wing sort of media channel in the UK. But there was an incident last year involving some students who were talking about Israeli and Zionist society at Exeter. They were handing out leaflets which said that it's legal to cut off food and water to the Gaza Strip. They handed out another which completely omitted that a single Palestinian had been killed in the Second Intifada, reducing it to nothing more than just, 1,000 Israelis died. Of course, no mention of curfews, any brutality from Israel, really. But anyway, what was so interesting to me was trying to explain to like an older person associated with the upper echelons of the university, this is not okay. What was your expectation? When people protest about Palestine, they are saying stop violence. They are not, very, very rarely are people out there even offering that much of an identification with the resistance because of sort of laws in the UK. But there is nothing to be offended about. Yet the university does not consider someone basically having a little celebration of the IDF to be problematic in any way, And it's just such a dichotomy of like, on the one hand, you have Palestinians who are just treated like their feelings don't even matter, that they're kind of just an afterthought, versus somehow now, all of a sudden, all of these publications who have spent years denying that black people face oppression, that anyone faces oppression in the UK, all of a sudden leaping to the defense of Israelis just saying, I feel offended by From the River to the Sea. And as you were saying, there is nothing, you cannot talk about offence at that when there is only one group that has ever been wiping away from the from the river to the sea in Palestine, and that has been Zionism. It's associated with the Likud, I know, but it's just this is always what Israel has wanted, isn't it? The famous slogan, both banks of the River Jordan or something, that Israel for a long time wanted, and yet we sit here and exist in a world in the UK where the government is kind of, and I think universities don't need that much of a push, but just doing as they say and maintaining this line of, it's anti-Semitic to compare Israel's actions to Germany, which to me is so perplexing because this Germany, like Nazism was not just a random outburst, as I'm sure that is the important thing to maintain about it. This was the culmination of European identity racist politics that basically said Jewish people are a danger to Western society and thus their extermination is required. Is it not incredibly similar that today we have Israel who says there is an ideology in Gaza that teaches children to kill, and so it's right to exterminate an entire people? And yet in today's society, I can celebrate the IDF, but I can't talk about that, and it's a very perplexing and frustrating world. And I think in part it's why it's so, going back to the point of like people losing hope, I think was the word that you were using, or becoming disheartened, I can't remember exactly. But people lose it because of just this fear of the reprisals, of the fact of like, God, if I spend my time talking about this or I go on a march, I work for this company and they're going to do this thing to me. The terrifying existence, and it's one that has to do with the institutional power that Zionism has to target people with groups like Lawyers for Israel, who can target a university or do whatever.
But I think the other thing that we need to think about is, and maybe this is too specific to the British context, but I saw it actually happening, until I left Britain. I left Britain in 2015, but I lived there for a long time and I saw a lot of things happen there during the period that I lived there. I saw the transformations that happened under New Labour and later on under the Conservatives. And to be honest with you, what you saw under New Labour, Chris, is the production of a new culture of conformity through the usage of the law. So, and a lot of this was connected to Palestine via the war on terror, but a lot of it had nothing to do with Palestine. It had to do actually with the domination of social institutions. I'll give you an example. My sector, academia. It used to be a relatively, a sector that had decent amounts of self-governance connected to it. And then good old Margaret Thatcher comes in and says, oh, there's no such thing as society, okay? And she comes in and dismantles all these social structures. Of course, in the service of a bigger thing, capital. New Labour, instead of reversing that, they come in and they're like, oh, we're going to actually wholeheartedly adopt this ideology when it comes to, for example, the universities. These are just places filled with lazy academics that sit down and do nothing. We have to now enforce on them measures and controls, and we have to hire bureaucrats to control them, and we have to, reshape the way they govern themselves in the workplace. So you used to have departments, for example, having a lot of power when it comes to everyday decisions. They no longer have that. Now you could be fired as an academic if you say something that a bureaucrat doesn't like. You know why? Because they bureaucratize the system. They've shifted the power from the actual person doing academic labor to the upper managerialist echelon that has nothing to do with that labor. So they've absorbed this sector into the alienated labor model that we see. And that means that people have less space to express their views, less space to organize, and to mobilize against anything, including when they see a genocide in which their tax money is funded. So that's one example. I mean, we've seen it in the NHS with the doctors and nurses, and now they're putting them under this regime of control. We've seen it in every sector of society. Okay, we've also seen an attack on the labor movement in the trade unions and their ability to mobilize and organize. And that has created, of course, this was from the days when Thatcher waged this campaign, but it got worse and worse, and it continued, even under Labour in different forms, because they spread this idea that you're not meant to be political, you're not meant to this, you're not meant to ask for too much, you're not meant. And that's basically saying you're not meant to exercise citizenship as a person. You're not meant to have political participation as a person. Your only participation happens in the ballot box on the day, and you're given this restricted amount of choices, very localized, and that's it. That's what I mean by de-democratization. Now, once you have this atmosphere of de-democratization coupled with an extreme and an excessive amount of reliance on legalized and proceduralized, elements of life, it's worse than in the United States, by the way. Now I moved to the States actually partly because of that. It's easier. It's not that easy there to come up and do a law that delegitimizes everybody. At least there will be some space where you can challenge that. In the UK, all what you need is some bureaucrat and government to come and say, well, we've adopted the HRA definition. Suddenly, yesterday, anti-Semitism was something else. It was hatred against Jews, calling for violence against them, hating Jews as Jews. That's what yesterday was. Anti-Semitism was yesterday. And rightly so, it should have been combated, attacked, and we all condemn it. The next day, because of some government decision, we're supposed to now view anti-Semitism as acting in solidarity with people that are being killed in a genocide. That's anti-Semitism? Really? And I don't want to just dwell on anti-Semitism here, Chris, because I think all of this conversation, I mean, it's a real issue, by the way, in society. We must combat it. Like we must combat, by the way, also Islamophobia, like we must combat anti-Palestinianism, which is a huge phenomenon, and anti-blackness, and transphobia, by the way, which all of these people that talk about anti-Semitism, half of them they engage in transphobia and homophobia and Islamophobia and hatred. Hatred has to be condemned wherever it exists. but it's about condemning the targeting of the group and hating on it. In the case of Palestinians now, actually, I would argue the biggest hate system in existence at the moment, because there is the genocide, is anti-Palestinians, which exhibits in the forms that you just mentioned, saying that it's okay for these people to be destroyed, normalizing their destruction by saying it's fine to have IDF soldiers coming and talking about their feelings whenever anybody protests and to prevent protests. When you prevent now a protest, a solidarity protest in Palestine, what you're doing is aiding and abetting genocide. Because that protest is designed to stop the genocide. Okay, so what you're doing essentially is aiding and abetting. It is absolutely disgusting. And that is a very anti-Palestinian thing to do. It is violent against our people.
Yeah, it's just particularly in this country, it's almost like a cult of fear that I find. This is the first year in 4 years of university where I've questioned whether I should write something about Palestine because of the implications of it for a university, like sort of discussing it. Like in previous years, I've written definitely about even topics within Palestine and Israel that I do think are somewhat more sensitive. For example, talking about Holocaust memory in Israel. However, this one, it just feels like now there is this threat, and I think that it's part of. Most of it is just an environment of fear, but you're right, there is also a very real element of some bureaucrat can just say something and all of a sudden journalists who have, maybe written things that are on the law to some extent, but are generally people who just show solidarity with Palestine, are being arrested. And I think it's this terrifying thing of just like, you're right, post-war on terror, just a world in which, Muslim people are just bad and evil and are basically erected as the main enemy of Western society to replace the communists, that as long as you're not a Muslim, you're one of us, and it's so interesting because it's also seemingly a massive forming thing for the far right, that they are happy to unite with Israel once upon a time, obviously having a massive, gaining a lot of their popularity from actually being anti-Semitic. They now realize, oh, that's a bad idea. We'll get in more trouble for that than if we just direct the same hatred and bigotry. And so, I think it is
but
so important to discuss it.
This is also a misunderstanding. The reason why it's so important to, when we talk about racism in any society, to understand, what it is. There is actually a traditional Jewish notion of what anti-Semitism is, and then there's a Zionist notion. And I think it's important for people to understand this. The Zionists subscribe to something that what historians call the lachrymose version of Jewish history. It suggests basically that, and this is something that Salo Baron, the greatest Jewish historian of the 20th century, he coined that term. He was saying that lachrymosity underlines this version because what it says is there's no context to Jewish oppression. It exists everywhere in the world, all the time, in every space, in the same way. Everybody is hating on Jews all the time, and the only solution, therefore, for Zionists, at least their answer to this lachrymose version, is to say that since there's this hatred that is existing across time and space, and that it has no contextual basis, that therefore there should be the Israeli state at whatever price. Whether that means expelling Palestinians, killing all of them, whatever, doesn't matter. Okay. That's the which is of course a racist view because it's saying Jewish oppression is more important than lives of Palestinians. Okay, I'm sick and tired, by the way, of hearing that. As a Palestinian, I'm telling people now, I'm announcing to your podcast, the oppression of Palestinians is just as important as the oppression of Jews. The killing of a Jewish life is no more important or less important than the killing of a Palestinian life or an Indian life or a South African life or a British life. Okay? So let's start from that premise, a humanist, universalist premise. But secondly, if we're going to look at anti-Semitism from a different perspective than the Zionist one, the one that was promoted by progressive Jewish historians of anti-Semitism, and by the way, current Holocaust scholars and genocide scholars, the leading ones, people like Raz Segal and others that have written extensively on this. What they'll tell you is that the forces of the right and the far right, that by the way, they were behind and the original anti-Semitism. These same people they were behind it. These were the people that were behind Mosley. And you know why they were behind it? In the case of British history, it's because they were anti-immigrant. At the time, the immigrants, the Muslims of that day were Jews, okay, that were escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe, escaping oppression in those lands, and coming in to London to work, and to the rest of Britain to work. And they were told, oh, these people speaking Yiddish, looking strange, having beards, and wearing hijabs, because Orthodox women, of course, Jewish women, wear their own version of the hijab, okay, their wig and so on. We know, okay, they look different than us. We don't like them. We don't want them here. And it's Arthur Balfour that passes a law that creates restrictions on Jewish immigration. An anti-immigrant law. It starts with him. In 1905, the Aliens Act. That's why, by the way, interestingly, all of these people that come and lecture at us from the right, all these conservatives that talk all this crap, I'm like, go study your history, first of all. Because you know what you were doing in 1905? You were not actually only specifically adopting an anti-Jewish policy. You were adopting an anti-Jewish policy because you're anti-immigrant. And you're against the other. Okay? And of course, that took anti-Jewish forms. Chris, because I need to get this file. Yeah, so that's one dimension to always remember, that this was essentially anti-Semitism was connected to anti-immigrant policy in the same way that Islamophobia is also an anti-immigrant policy. It's also an anti-religious diversity policy. It's also an anti-difference. The same people that find it hard to accept difference in society, they always say, well, these people are making me uncomfortable because they look different and they act different than me. These are the same people that are now hating on trans people, for example, and they used to hate on gay people. They're like, why is this person acting different and looking different than me? I don't want it. Really? It's like, and usually, by the way, the full combo comes in usually in the same package. They're the same people that are Islamophobic tend to also hate on others for a variety of reasons. Okay, so what we're dealing with now is a culture of acceptance versus a culture of rejection, a culture of diversity versus a culture of xenophobia. And the reason why the right now can live with the notion that it's not anti-Semitic is that, first of all, because of its racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant policies in 1905, there's only a very limited number of Jews in Britain. So they're not a demographic threat to their project of a Britain that is completely homogenous and that all looks the same. If you have only 300,000 Jews or so in the country, that's not as big of a threat to the 3 million plus Muslims. And if you notice, by the way, these people in the far right, I hear them sometimes talking. They are racist against Jews, by the way. It's just they happen to be racist more against Jews that haven't assimilated. In the sense that if they see, they always complain about, well, there are these parts of North London where people are wearing traditional Jewish clothes and whatever. They're uncomfortable with that. In the same way that, by the way, that they're uncomfortable with Muslims. Interestingly, by the way, I don't want to go on tangents. Judaism and Islam are actually very closely interconnected religions, and they exhibit in similar ways when it comes to religiosity. Because Islam borrowed heavily from Judaism around things like dress code and like the beard, whatever. When it comes to, if somebody wants to live that conforming life, that makes these racists on the right uncomfortable. They're just as uncomfortable when they see an Orthodox Jew as they are when they see a pious, observant Muslim wearing, sporting a beard or wearing a dishta. Okay, so their problem though is that there are several million Muslims. That's why they really care about this now, and they don't want them. This is actually an anti-British project that they're carrying through, because it's attacking the British tradition of diversity. By the way,
Yeah,
we've seen people,
that's right.
the people attacking also Sikhs because they thought they're Muslims, but they also don't like the fact that there are these people that wear turbans in our midst. Why? We don't want them. This mentality is very dangerous, Chris. It all interconnect. And now in the age of genocide, it assumes horrific, it has horrific implications, the age of genocide, because it's weaponized against anybody that comes out and says anything about this.
So one of the big developments over the recent weeks is Donald Trump's presidency, his return to office as the American president. And obviously, it's been the big issue of this election cycle of people saying, I will not vote for the Democratic Party as a result of their behavior. And there's kind of two approaches that people have taken to this, which is either, oh, I think that you should never endorse genocide, or Kamala Harris is objectively better than Trump. So kind of what's your opinion on what a Trump presidency will mean for Palestine? Do you think it makes a massive change, or is there really no change from what the Democrats have allowed during Biden's last term in office?
I think this issue is quite complex for a variety of reasons. One is there's always an issue when it comes to progressives in general in the US and elsewhere with regards to the American system, which is split into two dominant parties that do not tend to serve the interests of the weak or the oppressed, both at home and abroad. So one party tends to be characterized as slightly gentler, both on like domestic issues, working people, union rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, all of those kind of areas is seen as slightly more sympathetic or possibly gentler. However, the problem is if you vote for them, you reproduce the same system that ends up actually screwing everyone while making minor adjustments at best to the condition of people. So there's this dilemma, okay? And that's a long-standing dilemma that we cannot solve now. Trump, obviously, when it comes to all of these issues and Palestine, adds in additional challenges because he's associated with a far-right base, not just a conservative Republican base of the traditional kind. But that new Republican base has been in the making since the W era, and it's developed. It's gone further to the right on almost all issues, including social questions at home, and including, of course, the question of Palestine alongside many other things. So I want to start by contextualizing the debate in relation to this. And of course, there is an additional factor that's extremely important at the moment, which is that we've seen the Democratic Party launch a genocide in this case. They've led the genocide. Without them, it could not have happened, the Gaza genocide. They've armed it. They've given it diplomatic cover. They've given it rhetorical sophistry that allowed it to happen. They've given it ammo and weaponry on every level, both the literal level and also, of course, the figurative one. So I think it's very important to understand that when people said they're uncommitted, or when people said that they don't want to vote at all, both the uncommitted and those that were objecting to voting to the Democrats entirely were rooted in an analysis that understood very well that this is a genocidal presidency, the Biden presidency. And we've seen him celebrate the genocide even after the loss of the Democrats, the election. He had this ridiculous meeting with the Israeli president where he was saying, referring to the fact that his understanding of the issue is rooted in his father's experience as a righteous Christian, and that he views it in those terms. So This is somebody who's very ideological, but also this is somebody who's responding to special interests within the Democratic Party, the same interests that actually prevent the Democratic Party from taking better stances on everything, were the interests that were pushing for genocide. Because the Democratic Party has proven time and again that it does not care about working people, it does not care about marginalized communities, it does not care about racialized communities that are its traditional base. At the end of the day, it adopts sometimes policies that are very aggressive against those communities. In this case, it's taking it, though, to the next level. So it's presented a moral dilemma, not just a political dilemma of being caught in this two-party system, which is the usual dilemma. No, there's a big moral dilemma here, which is how can you vote for somebody who has committed genocide? And unfortunately, the dilemma is difficult to solve because you have the other candidate is associated with genocide plus plus, and you only have to look at, and I've been warning about this and talking about it very seriously because I know what it means to be backed by people like Miriam Adelson who demand annexation of the West Bank and have actually paid the price for it literally and publicly. In the same way that her husband, Sheldon, who died recently, had paid for the annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights before. And this is somebody who owns Israel Hayom, which is a right-wing Israeli newspaper, who lives in Herzliya in the Israeli state, and pushes right-wing politics within Israeli society as well as within American society. So it's somebody who's very aggressive. There are multiple people like that in that party. Even more worryingly, Trump's base includes Christian Zionists who are utterly insane when it comes to this question. They view it as a purely biblical question. And today, we learned of some interesting appointments that Trump plans to make. So he wants to appoint somebody, Pete Hegseth. Yesterday we heard that that's his pick for the key position of Secretary of Defense. And this is somebody who has a Jerusalem cross tattooed on his body, who's written books advocating a crusade against Islam and Muslims, who regularly speaks about the need to destroy the Haram al-Sharif and the Aqsa Mosque, which are, amongst the top 3 holy sites of Islam and are basically amongst the top architectural marvels of the world. And they are very important to the Palestinian people, but obviously to many Arabs and Muslims and others interested in world heritage as well. So he wants to destroy that, build a new temple. He wants an expansionist greater Israel. He has no conception of Palestinians except as people that need to be destroyed and expelled. This is the view. And if you have that as a Secretary of Defense, and you have, as is rumored, Marco Rubio, a Secretary of State, who is of the same mindset and has consistently advocated for the expansion of the genocide openly. These people talk about killing the entirety of the Palestinian people. And then you have people like Stefanik, who is rumored to be the next ambassador to the UN. So it's a genocidal bunch. They're very pro-genocide. They're against the Palestinian people openly. How do we deal with this? So that was always the problem. And I think, obviously, now at this moment, we can definitely say, it's the Democratic Party's fault for putting people in this position, as usual, by overseeing a genocide and refusing to stop it. And they continue to support it even now that the election is over and they can stop it. We had a supposed humanitarian deadline that Biden had set for Israeli state. He hasn't even respected that. Just passed. He doesn't even care about food reaching the people of northern Gaza. Bare minimum food, like minimum. So he's endorsing famine and supporting that, essentially, by doing that. It's unbelievable, Chris. What we're dealing with is unbelievable. But I fear that we're witnessing a situation where we're going to have an expansion of the genocide into the West Bank, where we're going to have regional pressure on states surrounding Israeli state to accept some kind of situation where Palestinians are deported and expelled en masse or otherwise killed into neighboring countries. We're going to see a situation that involves making these countries sign agreements under this Abraham Accords banner, which will be promoted as peace agreements, but what they are really are agreements that consolidate the destruction of the Palestinian people and try to perpetuate it. So it's grim times. Are there counterbalancing forces? Yes. Within the right, Trump has a certain base that is against supporting the Israeli state for the wrong reasons, by the way. I mean, these people are either isolationists, and some of them are actual anti-Semites. And there are, of course, anti-Semites that are very pro-Israel, which is the more dominant trend amongst anti-Semites. By the way, most anti-Semites, the real ones, happen to be rabidly Zionist. This is within the right, we see this because they believe in restorationist ideology, which eventually, and we spoke about this before, this ideology rests on a theological interpretation that is not friendly to the Jewish people and that involves either their mass conversion or their destruction as the new kingdom of God is brought about by the restoration of the chosen people to the promised land. So it's a crazy ideology. But it's a racist ideology. And it's a Christian supremacist ideology. But nevertheless, it's compatible at the moment with the interests of people like Netanyahu, so they promote it. In the meantime, we have to look at this map and understand, okay, there's this wing of the Republican Party that is wants withdrawal from the main wars happening at the moment, which are the wars in Ukraine and the war raging in the Middle East, including the Gaza genocide, but also the assault on Lebanon and other countries in the region. So how are they going to deal with this? Do they have the power to really change the overall course of the policy? It doesn't look like that's where we're heading. Not on the basis of the people that have been picked. So this is a serious issue. In general, I get very wary when left-wing discussions about future strategy do not take account of details. Because actually, Zionism, as Edward Said has always reminded us back in the day, he wrote a very important line in a great book called The Question of Palestine. He described Zionism as colonialism by detail. You know, they deal with it as whatever I can get at the moment, and the details do matter. Because if you have, let's say, an American president that tells you, take over the West Bank, they're like, that's great. Just take it over and run away with it. Create new facts on the ground, and then we have to deal with a new calamity. It doesn't mean that another administration that had just told them, go destroy the entirety of the Palestinian people in Gaza is any good. So yeah, that's what we're dealing with. It's a difficulty. We have moral questions at stake. We have strategic questions. The logic of lesser evilism is a difficult logic to engage in, and that's why people have been finding this conversation to be almost impossible. And that's why I've seen it descend in some quarters into finger pointing and I dare say even vulgarity in some cases. And I think within the anti-genocide movement, we have to have more generosity of spirit when we debate issues like this. Within the movement, if somebody's really against the genocide and somebody has shown commitment against it, they might have differing points of view on this. Some might be saying you're rewarding the existing administration, it needs to be punished. Others will tell you, okay, you punished it, but where do we head now? Okay. So, difficult questions. One more consideration to think about is that, and I think this is the most important, now that the voting question is done, we have to come back from the divisions that were created over that question within the movement. We have to consolidate our ranks because we're going to see a very difficult fight now. There are bills in Congress that will criminalize any organization, any university, any institution that the state deems as being too pro-Palestinian. And they'll use them to shut down institutions, including major ones, potentially. At least they'll scare them with this. So it's a very dangerous development. There are, and for those that think, well, the court system will then shut it down, I'm not so sure after Trump takes over the entirety of the court system how this is going to work. Cases going to state Supreme Courts and certainly to the Supreme Court itself, will not be judged favorably. In the same way that abortion is on the line in the court system, in the same way that LGBTQ rights are on the line in the court system, in the same way that all sorts of racialized communities are facing serious challenges in that system, Palestine will face challenges. So our ranks need to be very, very united. And, if we were to see like one silver lining potentially from a movement building perspective, is that historically it's always been easier to get the mainstream liberals on board, progressive issues when they have to face somebody like Trump. So, they can't come and say now, it's not the same as getting them to oppose Biden and Harris and co. Because now they're looking for reasons to, oppose the current administration. Of course, they have plenty of reasons. But the likelihood of them having to feel like they have to defend the genocide will decrease now under the current administration. So that's an opportunity for broader reach, for movement building. And I think we have to be very committed as people now to not getting demoralized, Chris. Because our sisters and brothers in Gaza need us to work. They don't need demoralization. Sitting at home will not help anyone. Not talking about it, not hosting podcasts about it as you do, not, educating as many people about it as possible, not getting as much political and civic and intellectual mobilization and action around it going on is a problem. And each one of us has a sector that they could play a role in. If you're a member of a faith community, you need to do work in your faith community. If you're a member of a union, you need to work within your union. If you're in a university, you need to get your university working. The entirety of civil society has to be activated now, and has to have good advocates within it. And I'm hoping that listeners to your podcast, Chris, will be amongst those advocates because we need them. And this is why I admire the work that you're doing, because you're reaching broader communities and you're reaching an audience that understands that the mainstream media has failed. The BBC, the major American channels, all of these people have been complicit in the greatest genocide of the 21st century. This is unbelievable what's going on. So people are needed. We owe it to the people of Gaza because our tax money is paying for their death and our governments are carrying it out.
So, given how insane the second half of Trump's previous presidency was with regards to policy on Palestine, for example, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and also effectively offering de facto recognition of Israel's sovereignty over Syrian land in the Golan Heights, do you think that it is a guarantee that the West Bank will be annexed? And if so, how can that possibly be reconciled with Trump's policy shown in the Abraham Accords? And how will they ever be able to get Saudi Arabia, most notably, to accept Israel's sovereignty over Al-Aqsa and also normalization?
Well, let's start by saying that the Abraham Accords were premised on the annexation of the West Bank, but under a different name. So what they were proposing is a map that entails annexation, okay? Because what annexation means in the West Bank has to do with what the Zionist movement has been doing in the West Bank for the past 30 years at least, since Oslo, okay? If you look at the map, it's divided into three types of areas: Area A, Area B, Area C. Area A are the areas with the highest concentration of population, of Palestinians. So they're the urban areas. Okay, it's places like Nablus, places like Ramallah, places like Hebron. These are main towns. Within them, however, you can have, by the way, presence of settler communities. For example, in Hebron, there's one inside the city, so they retain presence. But then you also have Palestinian demographic majority in some of the areas, some of the other areas. So, there's no strict definition of where Israeli control ends and where it begins. It's all contextual. Okay. Outside of this Area A, you have areas that are under partial Israeli control that are called as Area B, and then there's areas under full Israeli control, Area C. Effectively, what they've been doing is take over the countryside through settlements. And what you do is outside the urban cores, you just bring in a large number of colonists from outside. By the way, settlements is a misnomer. They should be really called colonies because that's what they really are. Yeah, and essentially they're bringing in these colonists. And they're getting them to establish a presence. They've been doing that long before Oslo, but they expedited the process after the Oslo Accords. Now, what they'll do and what they've been proposing in the Abraham Accords is, you create something that looks like Palestinian self-governance in the urban areas, but they're divided into numerous little subdivisions, and they look like an archipelago of islands in the midst of a sea of Israeli control. And of course, they're far away from any border, so they want to have access to the Jordanian border because the Israelis make claims around that. They say, well, we need to have control over the borders so that we can have security. Because Palestinians don't need security, it's only Israelis that need security, of course. And then they say we need strategic depth, so we need all of that land so that we can have strategic defense depth. Because Palestinians have no need for defense, of course, it's just Israelis. that have that, and the neighboring states don't have a need for defense either. It's just Israel that matters. So if you look at that map then, and I encourage people to Google, I mean, there was never, by the way, any precise definition of how it's going to look like, but there were proposals around it, and they're ridiculous. What they were talking about was an economic plan without setting up a state that has sovereignty or that has control over borders or airspace or that has a contiguous territory. And certainly they were not talking about implementation of international law, which we've just seen expressed very clearly by the International Court of Justice on this subject, where the entire Israeli presence in the West Bank, in Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and in East Jerusalem is illegal and unlawful and goes against numerous articles in the Hague Conventions. It violates the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's like it goes against like so many different aspects of international law. So we have a very difficult situation here, where they're going to try to pretend that they're providing a solution while actually creating annexation on the ground. They'll just call it something else. The Saudis can be a counterbalancing force, and you hope they will, but I have many doubts about it. Okay. In theory, it should be within their interest to not have a perpetuation of the current situation. And that's definitely been the traditional view of the Saudi establishment. Not a revolutionary establishment, by the way, not one that demands the full liberation of Palestine or anything else, but they've stuck to the bare minimum idea of at least have a Palestinian state in 67 territories. Why? Because their interest is in regional stabilization. And the Palestinian cause, so long as it's alive, you will not have stability in the Middle East, even though the Americans and the Israelis pretend otherwise. They keep telling people, oh yeah, you can have a stable Middle East with economic promises and with Abraham Accords. But with Palestine not being solved, you can't have that. So there were traditional voices within Saudi Arabia. Turki al-Faisal is one of these prominent voices. He talks regularly about the need for a real state in 67 and all of that. But you also have new voices around MBS that encourage a very different outlook. And they're saying what's important is to get close to the US. And it doesn't matter what happens to the Palestinians. And who cares? We can deal with our own population and popular pressure from the Saudi population around this by just ignoring it and suppressing all dissent, which they do anyways on this and numerous other issues. And we'll just bulldoze ahead. That's been the experiment they did that Abu Dhabi did in the Emirates. And as far as they can tell, they were able to pull it off. Saudi is a bit more difficult because it's a much bigger society with a longer history of very strong and active solidarity movements on Palestine. But still, if they can push this through, they might just do it. Do they have leverage? Yes. If they choose to change their position on this and take a more positive role, then I do believe they have leverage. I mean, the Saudis have a lot of money. They've given billions of dollars to Trump's corrupt son-in-law, who happens to be also a major leader of the settler movement, i.e. the colonist movement in the Israeli state. His family has been funding them for decades. They're ideological Zionists, that family. They love the most extreme aspects of the Israeli state, not just, the basic ones. They call for an expansionist Israel. And this is a guy who is not just a genocider, but has been talking about the genocide as a real estate opportunity. He's saying, you can have some really good seaside properties in Gaza. By the way, it's a horrific statement. I want people to pause and think about that. This is how these people think about the destruction and killing of children. So the Saudis have given them billions of dollars. They've allowed them to stay afloat. They've allowed these failed projects to succeed theoretically through pumping money. Do they have leeway? Of course. They have leeway because in the future they can pump money into the Trump family pockets for years to come after the presidency, which is what they did after the first presidency. They're a major regional player. They take a stance. It might work. So far, the only conservative forces in the region that have taken a stance expressing disapproval were the Jordanian state, which does not want the collapse of its own regime based on this insane plan to transfer the people of the West Bank to Jordan. And so they have every interest in taking a strong stance against this, at least within the empire. But also the country is in a very precarious position because it is a country with 13 U.S. bases. It is a country that depends on U.S. support financially, and it will not oppose, a U.S. administration or an Israeli administration when it comes to, actual practical moves on the ground. So, because it's a weak state at the end of the day. I mean that in the financial sense, but also in the overall military sense. If the U.S. decides to cut military supplies, it will be in trouble. So what do you do in a situation like this? They've been raising their voices, but so far they've been ignored. They've been ignored by an administration that's supposedly views them with favor. The Biden administration usually respects the Jordanian role because Jordan has helped them stabilize the region and has helped American interests in it for a long time. But they haven't listened around this genocide. The Israeli opinion matters much more. And then you have Egypt, which of course has been playing a very negative role in Gaza in its own way, but also does not want the transfer of the entirety of the population of Gaza to its territory. And they've been trying to say it's a bad idea, that transfer, without taking, of course, any steps on the ground, without being helpful to the Palestinian people, because that's not their number one priority. But, they're opposed to any regional deal that would, not solve the core, or at least some of the core issues. And, they're not going to be listened to. If the Saudis come in, it might be a different story. If you have a unified front, all the regional powers that are in the American bloc in the region, including the bigger ones, i.e. Saudi, come in, then Trump might have to have other considerations. And the pressure on the Saudis to take a better stance will not be a moral one. And it won't be because they care about what the people think in Saudi Arabia. It will be because of their relationship with Iran. After many years of futile clashes with Iran, they finally understood that it's a waste of their money and that it could also threaten key strategic interests for them. And they've been worried about the byproducts of the current struggle going on between Iran and forces affiliated with it in the region and the Israeli state. I mean, that's one of the reasons, by the way, why they were really keen to push the U.S. administration to prevent targeting of key Iranian installations on the part of the Israelis, be they nuclear or oil-related ones. Because Iran, and this is something for people who don't know about the geography of the region, the Iranian coast is literally just across the pond from Saudi Arabia and every other Gulf state. And it's across the pond from the oil production regions in Saudi Arabia. And a few years back, they've demonstrated the damage they could do with a small drone assault, not even done by them, but done by the Houthis from Yemen, that caused serious damage to the oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. If they want to cause greater damage, they can easily do that. I mean, they won't do it unless they have to, because then that sort of thing becomes like a zero-sum game at the end. Everybody will get destroyed, but they have that capacity. And they certainly have the capacity to do small attacks that will cause headaches. If they attack water desalination plants, that will cause a serious problem for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. They don't even attack the oil. I mean, you can just get everyone thirsty in that place because they depend on, especially the smaller Gulf states. I mean, Saudi Arabia has some sources of water underground, but they would have a serious problem. I mean, Dubai would not function, for example. So there are serious considerations that they have to think about, relating to the continuation of this disaster and this genocide. But will they act? We don't know, Chris. We've seen over and over again that sometimes what we think is the rational thing to do will not be the thing that people do. You see it over and over in history. I mean, if this was just about rationality and strategic calculations and material interests being so clear that people just follow them automatically without any mediation, which is sometimes the way the classic Marxist economistic line, and there are problems with it. I hear this a lot from some people on the left. Well, it's just material interest, and this is the way it works. Like, if that was the case, then there's a lot of things that happen in this region that would not have happened. Because there's the perpetuation of instability in this form in certain key areas is not good for the key extractive interests in the region or the key market interests in the region. There are many different dimensions to this that are very complicated.
I guess that also there's another interesting part to this, and it goes back to an earlier part you were talking about, which is it has been taken as indicative of the neighboring countries' hatred for Palestinians, that these sort of, like a country like Egypt or Jordan in particular doesn't want the Palestinians. But from what, how you speak about it, I think it's very obvious that derives much more from their own worries as authoritarians of, first of all, related to the image of Palestine, of their or the image of their commitment to Palestine, to capitulate in such a way to Israel and to just accept the ethnic cleansing would first of all be terrible with their own public popularity, but also just the fact of importing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who first of all ask the question of why were we ethnically cleansed and how dare you let that happen to us, and also and then second of all that becomes a question of this regime is not fit for purpose. And people always take in particular Black September in the 1970s in Jordan as an example of Palestinians as destabilizers. But seemingly it's just much more, as you put it in Thawra, that there is a limit to what these regimes can actually support, to what a regime like that in Jordan can actually do when it comes to liberation of Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, the limit lies in its relationship with empire, because the region is not a sovereign region. It's not a region that has achieved full independence, Chris, and that's the main thing that sometimes people forget. There was an attempt at independence and at creating a non-aligned regional system, and that attempt failed. That attempt happened under Nasser, okay, and it failed. For a while it worked, or it seemed to work for a while, but there were many strong forces that were pushing against it. And there were entire countries that never broke off from the imperial sphere of influence. And that includes the countries with the richest oil reserves, which were in the countries in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. And that's, and these started to play a disproportionately important role in the history of the region as a whole, because of the financial power that they have. So you have so many different aspects to think about when we're examining this equation. But The other issue to think about here is that just because a country was tied to empire does not mean that it was hostile to Palestine when it came to the personal dispositions of its leaders. Actually, more often than not, almost all of those leaders historically were very upset at what happened in Palestine. They do have, by the way, leaders have thoughts and they have, emotions and they have positions, sometimes good and sometimes bad. They're human beings at the end of the day, okay? Almost all of the older leaders were not, disposed to Palestine in a negative way. A King Faisal cared about Palestine, actually. Maybe not for the same reasons that you and I care for it. I mean, he saw it from a religious lens, for example. Okay, we think of it differently. Okay, but he cared. Sheikh Zayed was not happy at what happened to the Palestinian people. But now you look at their descendants and the current people that follow them, they might have a different idea. For them, they start thinking about Palestine as a burden, as an obstacle to having stronger relations with the U.S., because the U.S. is so invested in supporting Israel. So they change the view around this, and then they take the policies that they take. So it's a complicated subject. Some of the wiser ones know that this is stupid to do that, because Palestine is so essential, as I mentioned, to the future regional stabilization, for reducing the amount of local opposition to them. It's important for their legitimation politics. There are many different elements to this issue. As for the question of Palestinian refugees in Arab countries, I will tell you something, Chris, as a historian who specializes in this subject, actually. The main opposition to our people being absorbed by Arab countries and resettled there came from our people, and it still does, because we know what this means. No other people is required to resettle in the history of refugee problems. The international law on the subject is clear, but also morality is clear. If somebody expels you from your land, that does not mean that you don't have a right to return to it. And in fact, you do have the right to return to it. Because otherwise, if you didn't have that right, the world would become a jungle. Every power will find it convenient to expel whoever it wants and to not face any repercussions. Now, what's happened generally is that Israel has been exempt from application of international law on this. Everybody says, "Oh yes, I mean the international law exists on this, but let's not apply it here in this case, and let's create conditions that will prevent its application." So they were pressuring the Americans in particular, but also the Europeans, including the Brits. They're doing all sorts of shady moves in the 50s to try to resettle Palestinians. Whereas Palestinians were demanding not resettlement, but repatriation, going back to their home. I've said it over and over again. We don't want to live in other countries. We come from Palestine. We don't want to be in Egypt. Not because we hate on the Egyptians, and the Egyptians don't hate on us. By the way, we're culturally very close, and Egypt has a long history of love and solidarity for Palestine. And you only have to meet Egyptians in London, Chris, or Exeter, or wherever people live in the UK, to know that. How many will you find that are Zionists? None. There is no strong tradition of Arab hatred to Palestinians. That's a myth. That is not true. Some privileged Arabs wish they could be relieved of the burden of having to carry this cause because it's so heavy. Okay, but the average person on the street feels for the people. They worry about what's happening to the kids and the children and the women. They care about this situation for many different reasons and on the basis of many different outlooks and ideologies, but also because of long historic and cultural ties. Multiply that by 100 in Jordan, which is so intimately connected to Palestine you can't imagine how connected it is to Palestine. Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, these are Bilad al-Sham. They're historically that unit. The families are related. Everything. This whole separation between these areas was concocted by colonialism. However, Palestinians were always saying, yes, we're very close to these people. In fact, maybe in the future, we'd like to be part of a singular state within them. A lot of Palestinians have dreamt of Arab unity with these. Certainly, there's no problem with thinking about some future dream project with Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. I mean, there's a love for these countries on the part of Palestinians and vice versa. But the real question has never been, okay, do our neighbors hate on us or do we hate on our neighbors? The real question is, are we allowed to stay home or not? And maybe one way to think about it is, imagine if today somebody comes, where are you from, Chris? I know that, but like, maybe, do you want to share it with people, like, or not really? Do you not share that kind of?
I mean, I'm from England, but like,
From
yeah,
England.
like
Let's say you're from England.
Yeah, from England,
let's
yeah.
stick to that. Somebody takes over England and tells you you've been connected to Scotland for hundreds of years as part of a United Kingdom, and you're connected also to Wales. And we're going to expel you to Scotland and Wales, and you're supposed to, say, I'm okay with that because you know what? People speak English in Wales and in Scotland, and they have pubs as well, and they have they listen to Britpop. So, as far as any outsider is concerned, maybe in your countries you see big differences, but outsiders will be like, well, they're similar. Okay. Tell a Welsh person that, they'll be offended. They'll be like, but Wales is Wales and England is England. Yeah, we have connections that are very strong. I mean, you're part of the same polity for a long time, but we have our own scene, and of course, more worryingly for you as an English person, being displaced there and somebody telling you, well, it's all the same. And, why are the Welsh complaining? There's something wrong with them. There must be xenophobic. No, they recognize that a great injustice is being done and that the person doing the injustice is allowed to do it. And that if they accept this injustice to take place and this resettlement of the English people into Wales and Scotland to take place, then there will be a situation where they perpetuate the loss of people's homes. And I'm sorry, like, if your home is in London or in Cambridge or in Sheffield, you don't want to be in Edinburgh or Cardiff, even if you like those cities. Maybe you like Edinburgh even more because it's a very pretty city, a great place. But your home is in Cambridge or in Sheffield. Why do you want to go there? Your roots are elsewhere. And it's not voluntary. Somebody's forcing you collectively, en masse. So this is one way for people to think about it. I think when it comes to Palestine, I find it so astonishing, Chris. They get away with, people sometimes, forget to put themselves in Palestinians' shoes. I'm like, if you want to really have a good compass around anything, just imagine yourself being in the place of the afflicted people. For example, if you want to understand the African American struggle, just imagine yourself being under Jim Crow for one day. Being told that you're not allowed to go to the same restaurant, and you're not allowed to, and any white person can come and take your turn at the queue, and and you're supposed to also suffer attacks whenever people want to and they'll attack your communities and humiliate you. If you want to understand the situation of European Jews under the Nazis, imagine that. What does it mean to be living in places where the official aggressive government in power is saying that your people have to be eradicated? And if you want to understand the situation of native people, put yourself in their shoes. Same goes for the Palestinians. Put yourself in their shoes. Think about how their experiences are. Nobody wants to leave their home, no matter how close they are to the areas around their home.
And even going back to something we discussed last week is the fact that was recognized by Jabotinsky. He said that, this is something that you may be able to buy off some of the natives, but no one will trade their right to live in the land that they are from. And I think there's another part of which he talks about, this isn't just some borderland somewhere. This is what they see as home. And obviously this isn't really like this doesn't redeem him, because he doesn't deem any of the sort of Zionist project to be wrong at all. But yeah, I think that what's quite interesting here is you can see the importance of the work that is done, first of all, by Western propaganda that demonizes Muslims and just Arabs generally as irrational bigots and anti-Semites for no reason, and also the power of anti-Semitism here, portraying this as something that derives not from the desire to live in the land that they are from, to enjoy what is the land of people's ancestors, but rather because they just disdain Jewish people. And you can see, it's very obvious anyway, but you can see why it is very important to maintain this notion that there is no actual justification for Palestine beyond Palestinians just being anti-Semites and then Israel doing some bad things, which is really how it is portrayed in Western media, really.
Yeah, it's preposterous. Again, you will know by now, Chris, that my view of this world does not discriminate on the basis of any religion or ethnicity. I don't think that a Palestinian life is superior to a Jewish life. I don't think that a Jewish life is superior to a Palestinian life. I don't think that a white life is superior to a black life. We're all basically bodies roaming around in this world with minds inside of us, with spirits inside of us, with hearts beating inside of us. And only a very indolent heart can ignore that. Okay? Only somebody very prejudiced can ignore that. However, we have systems that obfuscate this very simple fact. And they create all sorts of stories based on myths around group actions. Like, the fact of the matter is, it's a manipulation of history in order to perpetuate injustice in the present. This is all what this is. So the solution is to reject injustice. Stop telling me, well, Palestinians think this, or Palestinians think that, or Palestinians are prejudiced or not. Answer basic questions. What are these colonists now doing expanding into the West Bank? What are these football hooligans doing around attacking Muslim communities in Europe and then claiming that they're victims, and where they include Mossad agents in their ranks? What is the United States doing proposing for the Ministry of Defense somebody who believes that Muslims should be eradicated in a global crusade? And we're talking here a global religion with over 2 billion people in it. This guy is nuts. Okay? What are we doing here? What is this clash of civilization stuff if it's not just pure hatred? So sometimes you feel like, well, this is the pot calling the kettle black. That's not the point that I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to say they're double standards and they're blah, 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 all of this kind of stuff. What I'm trying to say here is that there is a basic reality unfolding on the ground. There are attempts to ignore that reality and to justify that with reference to all sorts of historical accusations, claims about the other person that I'm hating on is no good. That's why it's okay for me to hate on them and to make their life hell and to destroy them. This is exactly what they're doing to us. They're saying, oh, but now they have a new variant. It's not a new variant. It's actually a new old variant, which is, they'll tell you, well, it's not, the problem is not with the Palestinian people. It's with whoever is leading them or whichever party represents them or whatever. So that's why it's okay to kill their women and their children and everybody else, because they're part of the Hamas is in charge in Gaza. So killing everybody in Gaza is okay. I'm like, really? And now they have a new, very dangerous thing being developed, Chris. And I would encourage your listeners to start reading it, because it's going to come next. The Heritage Foundation just released a report. I don't know if you saw it. And it's talking about, they're calling it Project Esther. And apparently that's going to be the new language they describe anti-Semitism with. They're claiming to be combating anti-Semitism. What they mean is they're combating Palestine solidarity and opposition to the genocide in Gaza. But the way they're doing it is they're claiming that anybody opposing the genocide is part of what they call Hamas Support Network, HSN. So that's the smear campaign now will be activated on a big scale. And I encourage people to get ready for it, because we shouldn't be afraid, but we should be ready for it. People are going to be making all sorts of ridiculous accusations, saying, oh, well, Chris hosts these Palestinian speakers and he talks about this as a genocide, which that means he's part of HSN. Really? That's not my reading of Chris. My reading of Chris is that he's somebody who cares about the loss of human life and wants to stop that. As simple as that. He doesn't like seeing children killed, whether in Palestine or in Congo or anywhere else in the world. Correct or not? I mean, that's my assumption, Chris. I mean, you seem like a nice lad to me. Like, it's like, yeah.
It's quite interesting as well. Like, I mean, you hear these discussions of people saying that the UN is Hamas and all of these things, and in one way it's comical, but it's almost the exact inverse of what you were talking about last week about how it's just a thread from anti-Semitism to this kind of bigotry. It is conspiratorial to claim that Hamas have the capacity as a group who can barely operate inside of Palestine after a year of being bombarded, starved, and targeted in the most unimaginable ways. And yet there are people claiming that they are operating something globally, as opposed to, as the point you are making here, that human beings and white people like me are willing to stand up and or have a feeling about something that isn't just accepting the line from our ancestors that it's okay to just sort of kill people because they're different, and won't accept everything that Westerners say is the like right way to rule, when very often the right way to rule has seemingly just been us sponsoring authoritarians. Up to this very day, our closest relationships are with people like Sisi and Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman. These people are authoritarians, and yet I just think that it's peculiar, because it's just conspiracies against Palestinians to make them this big evil who've degraded Western society. And these were the words that came out of the Germans' mouths and British anti-Semites.
Of course, and I always think that it's very important to, again, remember that the same strategies that were utilized against Jews, Gypsies, and other communities in Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century can be deployed against others in Europe as well, okay, and have been, okay, because it all depends on a question of perpetuating a certain majority. Racists, that's what they're obsessed with. They worry, Chris, when they see a diverse Britain, okay, and they worry when they see a diverse Europe, and then they'll come, well, it's about our values are being threatened. Yeah, I mean, that's what they were saying when they were saying that Jews were a threat to their values in the 1930s. Because again, oh, why are they wearing beards and why are they, we talked about this. And now, same discussion in relation to Muslims. What they forget is actually the true good values have to do with celebrating the diversity of the human condition, first of all. Secondly, what tends to happen in most societies that are open and embracing and dynamic, okay, is that you end up having people connecting and producing new ways of being and new cultures. And I see it in younger communities all the time. It's usually, I don't want to sound ageist, but but like old geezers like Trump. I'm like, yeah, you don't have like you never grew up in a diverse environment because your dad was a slumlord that made billions of dollars out of his, whatever. So you were only hanging out with people of a certain class and racial background. Um, and it's not surprising that you hate on everybody else, including Jews, by the way. I mean, you see his comments. It's crazy. He's so racist against everybody. It's like utter madness. But we don't want to just personalize it because, again, this has to do, as we mentioned, with structural processes. And the forces of hate, at the end of the day, reflect structural processes on the ground. They reflect certain class interests, anxieties around certain class interests. So these are big questions. But when it comes to the genocide, it should not be that complicated for anyone reasonable to come and say this has to stop. Any situation where 70% of the people being killed at least are women and children, what the hell is that? Where every hospital has been targeted, every school, every university has been destroyed. What kind of, you want to speak about barbarism? I hate that term, but this is barbarism. That is the ultimate in savagery and barbarism. To destroy all places of well-being and health, all places of education and knowledge, all places where society coheres and where people gather. In other words, to destroy Palestinian social reproduction and the ability at it in its entirety. That's what it's about. There's nothing more barbaric than that. It's like you can't convince me that there's any administration that's more barbaric than the Israeli one that carried out this policy. Okay, in the current world we live in, okay, there's a lot of awful things happening. But the fact that this policy is happening in broad daylight with the support of all the great powers of the world, how dare they come and say we're moral people that carry the banner of democracy and civilization against barbarism? Really? What's your civilization then? The great Jewish thinker Walter Benjamin once wrote, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. And he's right. He's very right. He was writing that in the context of the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe. He was absolutely right. Those people claiming to be civilized, by the way. Mussolini was saying, I'm the new Roman Empire. Look at my fancy buildings. Look at all the great stuff I'm doing. And Hitler, we don't even need to talk about the level. Everyone knows the level of horror he's unleashed, but, not the least against the Jewish people and the Roma people, who he described as gypsies, of course, it's a misnomer. But, it's unbelievable. And of course, gay people had to suffer under that. It's unbelievable how these people, they called it civilization.
Of course, and I think that you look at with how many Westerners, and obviously someone who grew up with a Western education, understands something like the extermination of Jewish people in Europe under the Holocaust. We don't understand it. We don't know what happened. Most people probably couldn't even give you a vague explanation of why the Nazis hated Jewish people so much, what they even said about them. It's just they did evil things because they were bad, and then you see on the other hand people like Césaire who are talking about this basically just being a reflection of European policies and all of the great work that's been done and literature produced in recent years about the line that goes effectively from westward expansion to Lebensraum, that Hitler loved America, that in this country he didn't see wonderful civilization. Well, actually, I guess he did. He saw exactly what he would then turn on Europe and on the Jewish people, and also on all of the Slavic people who he viewed just as subhuman.
Well,
And today,
this
those
is
who
why this is why we can't exceptionalize genocide, Chris, and this is why we have to learn the lessons from the Holocaust and other genocides, whether it's the Armenian genocide, whether it's the destruction of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, which was the first great grand, destruction on a continental scale. It was a horrific genocide. Whether it's genocidal aspects of the Atlantic slave trade, which caused entire depopulation and killing and murder, not to mention enslavement of peoples on a massive scale. All of that has to be understood as part of a process of domination, a process where one human group views another as expendable, as destroyable. And now, there's the only argument that they're using to deny the Gaza genocide now is, well, prove the intent. I'm like, it's not enough that every Israeli politician actually announced their intent and continues to do so. And I would encourage people to Google this awful cabinet that they have there. Just Google what they say. Okay. For years, even before the genocide. They have, but beyond that, I'm like, what about action? And this is something that Francesca Albanese, who's wonderful, she's the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine and the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. She's written about this in her latest report, which I encourage people to read. They're calling her anti-Semitic for telling the truth and for combating genocide, by the way. Now, it's unbelievable. But this person who loves Jewish history, who loves the history of all oppressed people, who's drawn her conclusions on the plight of people worldwide, and it's something that she's an expert on, who's very sensitive, by the way, very sensitive person. That's why she's so upset about this, but also very knowledgeable. She's saying, what about acts? Sometimes the intention is so embedded in the act and so clear in it. It's like unbelievable the amount of how do you explain somebody targeting a hospital 10 times, targeting a university they already destroyed again just for the fun of it, and then like making social media posts laughing about it. I'm like, if you really believe that was like a Hamas headquarters or whatever, you'd be engaging in fights with Hamas, not with women and children, not with educational institutions, not with health infrastructures, making lies about them. And then you get people reporting these lies without any form of scrutiny or journalistic integrity. Unbelievable world we live in, Chris. But I'll tell you something. I know that I love what you're doing. I love what the new generation is doing. I know they don't believe in this. I'm a university educator. I deal with young people all the time. Nobody believes any of this. I mean, this is, I don't know how you feel about it, but I think most young people I interact with do not believe the stuff that is being shoved down all of our throats by the people that are pro-genocide.
And I mean, also on this subject of intent and even the UN definition, is there not any? Are there any more pronounced examples in history, or of that are more pronounced than the fact that this is being implemented by a person? It's being implemented under the plan of someone who said Gaza should be uninhabitable for a long-term future, who has openly said that mothers are not innocent because they gave birth to members of Hamas, and then under his thought, this has been implemented and Israel is openly saying, we are going to kill life in northern Gaza, is that not destruction of the Palestinian people in whole or in part? Is this not genocidal intent that has gone unpunished to the point where it has become official government policy? And the fact that, having to watch, I don't know if you saw this because obviously England is less relevant, but Keir Starmer just yesterday said, when asked whether he would use the word genocide, said, you would do well to mention October the 7th, where before bringing up the word genocide, and then proceeded to say, I know the definition, so I'll never use that word. And just to hear him say that, a human rights lawyer who does categorically know that Israel is perpetrating genocide, but still many other war crimes that he could call out with far less pressure, to see him say that, it just feels ridiculous. And you're right. I don't think young people can accept that and could accept an answer like that shows that he can't even engage with it because he knows that there's no real defense.
Young people also know that the Palestinians suffered a zillion October 7th before October 7th. We've been suffering, not just, by the way, not just a day where you had a military incursion that resulted in the death of civilians, which is basically what October 7th was. I mean, if you look at it, forget about all the discriminatory discourse around it that says that Jewish life is more important than Palestinian life, therefore we have to value those lives more. I value every life that's been lost in any attack, okay? But if we look at it as what it is, okay, we've had a zillion, countless Israeli incursions into Palestinian territory that have resulted in hundreds of deaths, in hostage taking, because by the way, you know how many people have been jailed, abducted from their homes? Almost 45% of the Palestinian population at one point or another, the male population, been abducted from their home and put in the Israeli hostage system, which they call prison. Sometimes, by the way, we have to use better terminology. We don't accept those as prisons. We don't accept there's justice in that, because there's no court, anything. Anybody can take you anytime, and they do all the time. Okay. What does it mean to live under checkpoints on a daily basis? What does it mean to lose? Over the years, by the way, the ratio has always been at minimum 10-1. Do our 10 lives not matter, but the one Israeli life matters? And I'm going to say this boldly and honestly. Everybody pretends like October 7 is the only event that matters in this. Keir Starmer, how dare you say this? There were multiple. 20,000 people were massacred in the Israeli invasion of Beirut. Does that not matter? And the Sean McBride Commission showed and documented the horrors that resulted from the cluster bombs and the destruction. Now in Lebanon, several thousand lives have been killed, innocent lives, by wanton destruction. And they'll come and tell you, no, Israelis, they're motivated by good intent. They just want to fight terrorists. But Palestinians and Lebanese, when they attack them, they're doing it because of pure hatred. I'm like, let's imagine for a second, had Britain not decided to bring in Zionist movement from Eastern Europe and install their colonies in Palestine, would anybody have attacked any Zionist in Palestine? Would there have been any of these wars? Had this movement of Zionist colonists not conquered the territory, expelled the people from the land, did multiple massacres, introduced terrorism to the region, by the way. People forget this. First, car bombs were introduced by the Zionist movement. They brought all of this, by the way, from Tsarist Russia, these techniques, how to destroy a building with people, plant a bomb in it, how to do a suicide attack, all of that. What are we talking about? Keir Starmer comes in and says, oh, no, we should start with October 7th. Okay, include October 7th in the list. I'm fine with that. Let's include, by the way, every atrocity that has ever happened in the history of the land, let's include it. And then what you will find is that the ratio is at bare minimum 10-1. And after the genocide, now it's 100-1. More than 100-1. And that's putting aside even the application, which Keir Starmer will never talk about, of the fact that possibly more than half of the people that were killed on October 7 were killed by Israeli fire, which the Israeli press talks about, but nobody's allowed to talk about that in the West, of course. Okay, because they don't talk about the Hannibal doctrine. And if you come and say, they'll say, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. I'm like, no, go look at Haaretz reporting on this. Go look at even Yedayot Ahronot, they talk about the Israeli papers talk about it all the time. How entire homes were bombarded on that day. Okay, does it mean that Hamas didn't kill anybody? Does it mean that there weren't people from neighboring areas that didn't kill anybody? It doesn't mean that there was no context to that killing. That most of the people that actually entered these kibbutzes near Gaza on October 7 came from the land that these kibbutzes took over. Those kibbutzes were built on their land. Now, the worry is, Chris, because we live in such a rational world, they'll come and say, you're justified. Just if you say, I want to put it in context, or I want to note that there's a long series of assaults on the Palestinian people before it. It didn't come out of a vacuum. They'll come and tell you you're justifying it. Or you're part of the HSN, the support network. I'm like, no, I'm not. You don't know anything about me. But if you did, and people do that bother to read, these people don't read anything, half of them. But they'll know that, for example, I belong to the secular leftist tradition in the region. That's what I write about. That's my usual political affiliation. Okay. It's my outlook on life. I like to talk about class. I like to talk about feminism. I like to talk about workers' rights, and I like to talk about secularism and actually diversity. It's a diverse society, religiously, ethnically. That's what I care about. Unlike these people, by the way, who are opposed to all of that claim to be for justice and for caring. Unlike Keir Starmer, he's opposed to diversity because he hates on Muslims, by the way. And he has an anti-Palestinian agenda. And he's an awful, awful promoter of that agenda, and he's a pro-genocider now. Shame on him. Unbelievable. I mean, it's very upsetting. The reason, I might sound harsh on these people, Chris, but it's coming out of a place of pain. Because again, you see what they're doing to people you know. You see the deaths they're causing to my people. I would have cared about it if it happened to any people, honestly. But when it's against your own people, no matter how internationalist you are, you feel it a bit harder when it's closer to home because you know people and you feel their pain on that kind of very deep personal level. It's hard. I can't begin to describe it. And every day I have to wake up, Chris, and I know it's the same for most Palestinians that I know. All of the Palestinians I know, not just most. And you say, how am I going to get myself through this day? Because you're either guilty at feeling that you've survived because you're outside, and you could have easily been inside because your friends and neighbors and relatives and people you care about are there. It's just by chance, by fluke, you ended up elsewhere when our people were expelled from their lands that they now call the Israeli state. So sometimes you feel that, or sometimes you feel guilt. There's that survivor's guilt. And then other times there's this feeling of like, why am I not strong enough to be able to stop it? Why am I so useless? Why am I, it's like this kind of like, no matter how much you're doing, you feel not doing enough. And then if you have a minute of joy, you feel guilty about it too. Because you're like, why did I just go to a dinner or party or whatever when people I know cannot eat? It's very miserable, this situation. And In the meantime, you hear people like Keir Starmer and others, it just fills you with so much rage because you know also that deep down inside, this is actually an opportunist that doesn't care about anyone. If you don't care about a genocide, it means you don't care about anyone or anything. You just care about power. You're an empty vessel. You know, this is the sort of person that perpetuates evil in this world through this. It is because what's happening is evil. And really, you know, Father Munder Ishaq, when he gave his Christmas sermon from Bethlehem, I don't know if do you remember it, Chris?
I remember this happening. Yeah. I remember this.
I encourage people to check it. He gave his sermon from Bethlehem. He said, and I still believe he's right on some level, when he said, like, you know, Palestinian people will be okay after the genocide. And he didn't mean it, by the way, that will be okay in the physical sense, because he knew that a lot of us will be eradicated, and possibly all of us, except for the ones that are living far away. You know, but what he meant is spiritually. You know, he's obviously a man of religion. He's a very spiritual person. I might not be that, but I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual that way. I believe he's right. People are not going to be okay in that moral sense, in that spiritual sense, in that what the hell are you doing on this earth sense. Are the people that have turned a blind eye, or even worse, supported this? It's a huge crime that's being committed. And they might minimize it in their heads, and they might distract from it. They create narratives around it. Oh yeah, I'm doing the right thing because I'm speaking on Israeli suffering and the right to self-defense. I'm like, really? When was the last time any Israeli had to pass through a Palestinian checkpoint? When was the last time any Israeli had to be worried about their basic civil and political rights under Palestinians? When was the last time Palestinians occupied the Israeli state? When was the last time Palestinians were settler colonists that came from outside and took over Israel? It's insanity. You know, there were many problems with George Orwell, but he captured this kind of way of thinking very well in 1984. And war is peace and all of that. Like, these people are so Orwellian, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And now, even those Jewish sisters and brothers that speak out will be criminalized by people like Keir Starmer and others. They're expelling them from the Labour Party. And I'm like, yeah, right. You're going to tell them too about what's the right thing to do. Unbelievable.
Of course, and also just, you know, I mean, this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, particularly with sort of comparisons between people who say, oh, well, what did you expect Israelis to do after October the 7th? What was expected of Palestinians after Sabra and Shatir, you know, that life just went back to normal, that everything was okay, that Israel could just remove a couple of people who were involved with it and not even arrest them. I mean, I think that also, you know, on this element of when people say, oh, the Palestinians chose Hamas, Israelis chose Ariel Sharon in 2002, right? Whenever he was elected. At that point, they made this choice of a guy who even their own government, the Kahan Commission said, yeah, this guy was deeply involved. And it's not a secret. There's things of him openly saying, we're going to kill Palestinians in the camps. And Israelis chose him. And yet, to this day, it's only Palestinians who should be held to account for their choice, or we should only consider what they've done.
What the real question also goes back even further, you know, and you're right, absolutely right, Chris. But even before, what were Palestinians supposed to do after a state like Britain, who has nothing to do with Palestine, feels entitled enough to say, we view favor the establishment of somebody else's national homeland here? suddenly, oh, every British politician is a historian and they get to make decisions on Palestinian history, and then based on some historic connection from like a distant past from thousands of years ago, they come and tell you now, you pack your bags and leave. It's like Bill Clinton, what he was saying. He was repeating the same thing. Oh, wow, these people were there first. We talked about this. It's like, what are you talking about? First of all, you know nothing about ancient history. Secondly, ancient history has nothing to do with the present. You know, if you knew something about ancient history, you knew that this was the land of Canaan, and the original people were Canaanites, and the Palestinians are descended from the mix of Canaanites and everybody else that got mixed in this land. You know, so, but even if they weren't, nobody has the right to displace an entire group that's been on a place for thousands of years, or hundreds of years, or dozens of whatever. I mean, I'm even against the displacement of current Israelis, even though they're just basically showed up. By the way, a lot of them just came from Soviet Union in the 90s and 2000s, and some are coming from Brooklyn now. You know, I'm for decolonization and anti-colonial liberation, but these people are for expulsion. They're for, because they're ethnic supremacists and they're ethnic Puritans. They want to see ethnic purity. They're opposed to the idea of the land being occupied by anybody who does not belong to an ethno-religious group, a particular ethno-religious group. Doesn't matter what that group is. It could be Jews, it could be any other ethno-religious community. It would be wrong to think of the world in that way. That's the problem with Zionism. So, very painful stuff and very cynical stuff. And the use of legitimate questions like the question of anti-Semitism to justify it is awful, but also the total disregard for the presence of anti-Palestinianism. And this is why I think, Chris, I'll end on this note. I think in the future, the discussion should always center Palestinians. I actually wish that Jeremy Corbyn did that when the whole anti-Semitism controversy was going on around him. He had come and said, you know what, this is about Palestinians actually. And you keep evading the fact that it's about Palestinians. It's about them being oppressed. And it's about me caring about their oppression and not wanting it to continue with British support and help. As simple as that. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't turn it into a domestic British issue of interfaith struggles or competition within Britain and then turn immigrant communities and faith communities against each other by doing that, which is totally wrong. You know, talk about the thing in itself. You know, anybody that wants to talk about Israel, it's very simple. Pick up history books on the subject. You'll find that no serious historian now will accept the traditional Zionist claims. They used to in the past produce all sorts of stuff. There were no good studies, but they've been debunked. And since the archives have been opened, it's over. For the present, educate yourself. Just go read any major human rights organization. All of them, in fact, describe Israel as an apartheid state. Is that the sort of state you want to support? That was long before October 7, by the way. It was officially thought of that way. The UN has long counted it as an occupying power that is maintaining an unlawful occupation. Now we have an ICJ ruling confirming that. ICJ has demanded that it follow the Genocide Convention and follow its responsibilities on that, give it specific duties under that. It didn't implement them. And the list goes on and on and on. The documentation is unbelievable. The evidence is unbelievable. So stop trying to change the conversation. Remember, this is about the Palestinian people, what's happening to them. At the moment they're facing a genocide, before they were facing a system that is extremely racist, a system of military occupation, which means use of daily violence, by the way. Sometimes on a big scale where thousands of people would be killed, sometimes on a daily grinding scale where they just humiliate you in your everyday life and control your body. It's unbelievable. The system is insane. And, there's so much obfuscation on it that it was hard for ordinary people to know about that. But now we have the internet, you could do that. Sometimes very smart people didn't understand it until they visited. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates now, he spoke about that he didn't really know what was going on. And he even wrote some stuff that he regrets writing now before he visited. But once he went and visited and saw what was going on, he's like, wait a second. This is like Jim Crow plus plus. This is whatever I thought or was told. It does not make sense. You just have to spend like 1 minute there to understand that this is a deeply racialized society and a deeply colonial society. It combines, by the way, racialized systems, colonial systems, apartheid systems. It's impossible to encapsulate under one banner the analysis, by the way, because settler colonialism meets apartheid, meets petty apartheid, meets systematic apartheid, meets racialization, meets machismo expressed through militarism. It's so many interconnected forms of violence. So let's remember, this is about the people subjected to that violence on a regular basis. And yes, you can come and point out to the history of any oppressed people and say they fought the system that was oppressing them in ways that I don't like, or they've committed atrocities in that. Native people in the US, by the way, sometimes did scalp white people that were doing incursions against their lands and killing their flocks and their people and their kids. But you know something? They learned that from these people that were invading their lands, and they were subjected to far greater violence, and they lost their lands at the end of the day to this violence. African Americans, look at their history. Of course, there were enslaved people in revolts, and sometimes they led to killing of slave owners, all sorts of people associated with them, sometimes even innocent women and children. Doesn't mean that killing was right, but it means that it came from somewhere, and that there was something far more evil going on against the African American people. In Haiti, the greatest anti-colonial revolution of all time, so white people getting killed. There were atrocities even under Dessalines. But why did that happen? Because they didn't listen to Toussaint, who said, we just want to be equal French citizens. We just want to be free. And then even under Dessalines, by the way, they had a plan to genocidally destroy the whole people that managed to get free, kill them all and replace them with new enslaved people from Africa. And you're going to tell me I'm going to focus on just the killing of white slave owners, for example, or white women in that island? I have to put it in context. I have to also choose who am I going to affiliate with. Am I going to affiliate with the system that is ultimately a racist system that is not going to take us anywhere except through a path of constant domination? Or am I going to affiliate with a system that is searching for solutions, for common visions for both peoples on the land, for liberation of both peoples on the land? And liberation of both peoples on the land means setting aside and rejecting racialized views, establishing secular democracy that allows for both people to be integrated together, recognizing the destruction that happened against Palestinians and reversing it, including through giving people back their lands that were stolen from them and allowing them to get back to their homes. There's all sorts of moves that could be done to encourage a just resolution. And instead of viewing these moves as the problem and the obstacle to peace, they are the pathway to peace. Pathway to peace is in the right of return, is in reparations for the Palestinian people and admission of guilt and violence committed against them over decades. Britain should be part of these reparations, by the way. That country owes us a lot. It caused the whole problem. So, but we're not even there yet. Now we're in the midst of Britain supporting a new genocide against us. It's like, but we still have to imagine the future society. And I think South Africa gives us some hope. It's an imperfect model. There's still a lot of injustice there against ordinary Black people. The transition hasn't been perfect. But at least now you have some political rights that are shared by everybody, if not economic and social rights. So it's a step forward. And perhaps that's why the South Africans have intervened more forcefully in this than anybody. It's people like the South Africans and the Irish and people who've experienced different forms of colonialism within and outside of Europe that have really understood what this cause is really about.
Well, thank you very much, Abed. Thank you for that long conversation. It's honestly been fantastic. I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to plug, but obviously one of the reasons for doing this was to discuss actually not really to discuss, but to promote the Dig Radio's Thowra podcast that you did with Daniel. And as I said at the beginning, it is truly one of the most excellent resources on Palestine, the wider Middle East, even as someone who has 2 degrees in Middle Eastern studies. It was honestly things that I'd never heard about, new ways of viewing the Middle East. And honestly, I cannot recommend it enough. And if there's anything else, I mean, your book as well, although I've only read a section of it, it is fantastic. Monsoon Revolutions, which covers the part I've read about was the Dofari Rebellion.
Well, I mean, the Palestine Revolution website is great. And that's a project I did with Carmen Abulsi back in the day. But I think it's still useful because it allows us to interact and understand a much misunderstood aspect of this story, which is the history of Palestinian revolutionary thought and action. But the one thing I want to say, Chris, is that I really appreciate you hosting me. It's through acts of concern and love that we can combat this unjust world that we live in and that we can sustain ourselves in it. I always have to remind myself that. I know this is going to sound cheesy and maybe people I talk a lot about hard facts and about geopolitical analysis and stuff like that, but deep down inside, I'm actually a romantic in a way because I genuinely believe in humanity. I genuinely believe that not only that we're all equal, but that most of us, if we remove the obfuscation that surrounds us and the sophistry that surrounds us, would actually rather be driven by love than by hatred. And I have a lot of love for everybody out there that is willing to stand on the side of justice, because that's the only side that exists out there. There aren't 2 sides to this equation or to any other situation of oppression in this world. The only side is the side of justice. And that should always be our compass. And I hope that our hearts will always guide us in that direction.